The reports arriving at the Imperial Palace in the early decades of the 30th millennium painted an increasingly dire picture. Across the Ullanor sector and its neighboring systems, a Greenskin empire was expanding at a rate that alarmed even the most experienced military strategists of the Imperium. What had begun as scattered Orc holdings had coalesced under the brutal leadership of Warmaster Urlakk Urg into something far more dangerous, a unified Wa of unprecedented scale and coordination. The speed of this consolidation caught Imperial planners off guard. Within a span of years rather than decades, Urlakk Urg had subjugated rival Orc clans, absorbed their forces, and turned dozens of worlds into massive war foundries, churning out weapons, vehicles, and spacecraft at a staggering rate. The Ullanor sector itself became the beating heart of this empire. Intelligence reports indicated that the primary world of Ullanor had been transformed into a fortress factory of continental proportions, its surface covered in sprawling settlements that housed billions of greenskins. The Orcs had strip-mined entire planets for raw materials, redirecting asteroids and smaller moons to feed their insatiable appetite for metal and fuel. Orbital stations, crudely constructed but functional, ringed key worlds throughout the sector. These weren't the ramshackle structures typically associated with Orc construction. They showed a level of planning and resource management that suggested Urlakk Urg possessed an unusually keen strategic mind for a greenskin warlord. The Imperial War Council, convening in the secure chambers beneath the Imperial Palace, reviewed data streams from multiple sources. Reconnaissance vessels that had survived encounters with Orc patrol fleets transmitted sensor logs showing fleet concentrations that numbered in the thousands of vessels. These ranged from small attack craft and escorts to massive kill cruisers and battle cruisers, some of which matched Imperial capital ships in tonnage, if not sophistication. Naval intelligence officers noted with concern that the Orc shipyards were producing vessels at a rate that suggested the Greenskins had mastered large-scale industrial processes. The traditional Orc approach of cobbling together ships from scrap had given way to something approaching actual naval architecture. Ground-based reconnaissance painted an equally troubling picture. Picked captures and augur readings confirmed the presence of numerous gargants, towering war machines that stood as tall as Imperial warlord titans. These mechanical monstrosities bristled with weapons and served as mobile fortresses around which Orc armies could rally. The War Council's assessments indicated at least several dozen of these machines operational across the Ullanor sector, with more under construction. Supporting these behemoths were countless stampas, battle wagons, and other armored vehicles. The sheer industrial capacity required to field such forces indicated that Urlakk Urg had organized his empire with frightening efficiency. Population estimates proved difficult to calculate with precision, but even conservative projections placed the Greenskin numbers in the tens of billions. Some analysts argued the true figure might be higher, perhaps exceeding 100 billion when accounting for Gretchen, Snotlings, and other Orcoid subspecies. The fertile ground of conquered worlds allowed Orc spores to spread unchecked, and each victory fed the Wa's momentum, drawing more Orcs to Urlakk Urg's banner. This biological reality of Orc reproduction meant that time itself was an enemy. Every month of delay meant millions more greenskins reaching fighting age. The historical context made these developments even more alarming. Imperial historians and remembrancers attached to the War Council drew comparisons to the War of the Beast, an ancient conflict from Old Night when a massive Orc empire had nearly overwhelmed humanity's scattered holdings. While the full details of that war had been lost to time, enough records survived to demonstrate the existential threat posed by a truly unified Greenskin empire. The Ullanor Wa showed every sign of reaching similar proportions. Some analysts went further, suggesting that if left unchecked, Urlakk Urg's empire might surpass even those ancient threats. The geopolitical implications extended far beyond the immediate military threat. The Ullanor sector sat astride several crucial warp routes that connected the Imperium's eastern territories with Terra. Should the Orcs consolidate their hold and expand further, they could effectively cut off entire segmentums from the Imperium's core. The Great Crusade's momentum, which had seen human forces pushing outward in all directions from Terra, would stall. Expeditionary fleets operating beyond Ullanor would find themselves isolated, their supply lines severed, forced to fight their way back through Orc-held space or face destruction. More troubling still was the potential for the Wa to turn toward Terra itself. The Orc psychic gestalt, the collective consciousness that drove their species toward ever greater conflicts, would inevitably draw Urlakk Urg's attention to the Imperium's capital. A Greenskin empire of this magnitude, if allowed to reach critical mass, could launch an assault on the throne world with forces that would dwarf anything the Imperium had yet faced. The defensive installations around the Sol system were formidable, but they had been designed to repel raiders and conventional invasion forces, not an Orc-Wa numbering in the billions, with fleet assets to match. The War Council reviewed records of previous engagements with Urlakk Urg's forces, and these made for grim reading. Several expeditionary fleets had attempted to contain the Orc expansion in its earlier stages. The 203rd Expeditionary Fleet, under the command of Lord Commander Kashyyyk Dorn, had engaged Orc forces in the Advex Moor system 3 years prior. Despite achieving initial tactical victories and destroying several Orc shipyards, the fleet had been forced to withdraw when Greenskin reinforcements arrived in overwhelming numbers. Kashyyyk Dorn's after-action reports emphasized the unprecedented coordination among the Orc forces. They had responded to Imperial movements with surprising speed and had demonstrated actual strategic planning rather than simply charging forward in typical Greenskin fashion. Another attempt by the 140th Expeditionary Fleet had met with disaster. Assigned to strike at Orc holdings in the Karanda system, the fleet had walked into a carefully prepared ambush. Orc forces had used captured Imperial Vox frequencies to lure the fleet into a gravity well surrounded by asteroid fortresses. The engagement had cost the Imperium 7 capital ships and over 40,000 Imperial Army personnel. The fleet commander, Admiral Hecate Vin, had escaped with less than half her original force and reported that the Orcs had fought with a level of tactical sophistication that defied conventional understanding of Greenskin behavior. These failures demonstrated that standard Imperial doctrine for dealing with Orc threats was insufficient against Urlakk Urg's empire. The traditional approach of striking at Orc leadership and allowing infighting to fragment Greenskin forces had proven ineffective. Urlakk Urg maintained iron control over his subordinate warbosses, and his authority appeared unshakable. Assassination attempts by Imperial agents had failed. The warboss surrounded himself with elite bodyguards and rarely exposed himself to direct attack. His command structure showed redundancy and delegation that allowed the Wa to continue functioning even when individual warbosses were eliminated. The industrial capacity of the Orc Empire particularly concerned Imperial strategists. Captured Orc equipment showed surprising standardization. Where Orc weapons typically varied wildly in design and quality, reflecting the individual mech's preferences, the arms flowing from Ullanor's forges showed consistent patterns. Bolter-equivalent weapons emerged from Orc foundries in batches of thousands, each nearly identical to the last. This standardization allowed for easier maintenance and ammunition supply, giving Urlakk Urg's forces logistical advantages rarely seen among Greenskins. The implications were clear. The Orcs had moved beyond mere raiding and looting into actual empire building. Intelligence reports from rogue traders and independent merchants who had observed Orc-held territories from a distance described vast mining operations and agricultural zones worked by slave populations. Humans, aliens, and even other Orcs deemed unsuitable for combat labored under brutal conditions to feed the Wa's appetite for resources. This exploitation of conquered populations represented another departure from typical Orc behavior. Rather than simply killing or eating their captives, Urlakk Urg had organized a system of forced labor that maximized resource extraction. The cruelty was no less than expected from Greenskins, but the efficiency was unprecedented. The War Council's deliberations grew increasingly urgent as more reports arrived. Orc raiding parties had been detected probing Imperial space along a front spanning hundreds of light years. These weren't random pirate attacks, but coordinated reconnaissance operations. Captured Orcs, when interrogated before their inevitable deaths, spoke of Urlakk Urg with a reverence bordering on religious fervor. The warboss had become more than just a military leader. He embodied the orc concept of strength and success to such a degree that his legend alone drew greenskins from across the galaxy. Astropathic choirs reported increasing difficulty maintaining communications through the Ullanor sector. The psychic turbulence generated by billions of orcs created interference that disrupted warp travel and vox transmission. This psychic pressure would only intensify as the Wa grew, potentially creating a dead zone in Imperial communications networks. Isolated worlds beyond this barrier would be cut off from Terra, vulnerable to orc attack or other threats without hope of reinforcement. The scale of the threat demanded an unprecedented response. When the full intelligence briefings reached the Emperor of Mankind within the Inner Palace, his decision came swiftly and without equivocation. The Master of Mankind would personally lead the campaign against Urlakk Urg's empire. This announcement sent ripples through the highest echelons of Imperial command. The Emperor had not taken direct field command of military operations since the final stages of the Unification Wars, preferring to delegate such matters to his primarchs and their legions while he focused on the broader strategic direction of the Great Crusade. His choice to personally oversee the Ullanor Campaign signaled to all observers that this was no ordinary military operation. The summons went out across the galaxy through the Imperium's astropathic network. 8 complete Space Marine legions received orders to converge on designated rally points. The Luna Wolves, led by Warmaster to be Horus Lupercal, were the first to receive their orders. The 16th Legion had been operating in the northern reaches of the galaxy, bringing worlds into compliance with characteristic efficiency. Horus immediately began extracting his forces from their current deployments and redirecting them toward the Ullanor sector. The Blood Angels under Sanguinius received similar orders, pulling back from their campaigns in the eastern fringe. The White Scars of Jagatai Khan, already operating relatively close to the target zone, began their redeployment with the speed that characterized their legion's methods. Rogel Dorn's Imperial Fists received the call while engaged in fortification operations across several systems. The 7th Legion's expertise in siege warfare would prove essential for reducing the orc fortress worlds. The Ultramarines of Robute Guilliman, the largest and most tactically flexible of the legions, represented a substantial portion of the assembled force. The Space Wolves under Leman Russ brought their savage efficiency to the muster, as did the Dark Angels led by Lionel Johnson. The Emperor's Children, Fulgrim's perfectionist warriors, added their precision to the gathering storm. Each legion brought tens of thousands of Space Marines, along with their supporting fleets, equipment, and auxiliary forces. The coordination required to assemble this force tested the Imperium's logistical capabilities to their limits. Each legion operated across multiple war zones, and extracting them from ongoing campaigns meant reassigning other forces to hold the line in their absence. Expeditionary fleets had to be recalled, treaties with newly compliant worlds had to be accelerated or postponed, and entire strategic plans had to be revised. The Adeptus Munitorum worked around the clock processing movement orders, supply requisitions, and transport assignments. Thousands of bureaucrats and administrators labored in the vast archives beneath the Imperial Palace, calculating tonnages, fuel requirements, and transit times. The Imperial Army contribution dwarfed even the massive Space Marine deployment. Hundreds of regiments received mobilization orders. These ranged from elite formations like the Lucifer Blacks and the Palatine Guard to line regiments drawn from thousands of compliant worlds. Tank companies, artillery battalions, infantry divisions, and specialized units began their journeys toward the assembly points. The sheer diversity of the Imperial Army forces reflected the Imperium's vast reach: desert fighters from arid worlds, void-born soldiers accustomed to zero-gravity combat, heavily augmented troops from Forge worlds, and countless others. Each regiment brought its own equipment, traditions, and methods, creating a logistical puzzle of staggering complexity. The Mechanicum's contribution proved equally substantial. The Fabricator General of Mars authorized the deployment of multiple Titan legions, recognizing that the Orc Gargants would require the Omnissiah's greatest war machines to counter them effectively. Legio Mortis, the Death's Heads, began preparing their god machines for deployment. the Legion's Warlord and Reaver Titans underwent extensive maintenance rituals and blessing ceremonies. Legio Ignatum, the Fire Wasps, similarly readied their forces. These Titan legions represented the pinnacle of the Mechanicum's military might, and their deployment required elaborate preparations. Each Titan needed specialized transport vessels, massive quantities of fuel and ammunition, and dedicated tech priest attendants to maintain their systems. Additional Mechanicum forces included Skitarii cohorts, Thalax shock troops, and batteries of artillery pieces that ranged from conventional cannons to exotic energy weapons. Tech priests from various Forge worlds brought their expertise in battlefield engineering, communications, and logistics. The Mechanicum's contribution extended beyond purely military assets. Their representatives would establish and maintain the vast network of supply depots, repair facilities, and communications relays that would sustain the campaign. The fleet assembly began at multiple locations across Imperial space. The shipyards of Mars, Luna, Jupiter, and Saturn worked at maximum capacity to prepare vessels for deployment. Battleships, cruisers, escorts, and transports gathered in designated staging areas. The fleet would need to transport millions of personnel, thousands of armored vehicles, hundreds of Titans, and the supplies to sustain them all through extended combat operations. Naval architects and fleet logistics officers calculated the optimal composition of battle groups, balancing firepower, transport capacity, and strategic flexibility. The scale of the fleet assembly exceeded anything attempted since the Emperor had unified Terra and launched humanity's expansion into the solar system. Thousands of vessels of all classes converged on the rally points. Capital ships that had been operating independently for years joined larger formations. Escort squadrons that had been protecting supply convoys received reassignment to battle groups. The coordination required to prevent collisions, manage fuel distribution, and maintain formation discipline challenged even the most experienced fleet commanders. Forward operating bases began taking shape in systems leading toward Ullanor. Imperial forces seized control of strategically positioned worlds and moons, establishing fortified positions that would serve as staging areas and supply depots. Pioneer companies of the Imperial Army, supported by Mechanicum construction teams, erected prefabricated structures, landing fields, and defensive installations. These bases would serve multiple purposes. They provided secure locations for forces to gather before the final push. They established supply lines that would feed the advancing armies, and they created fallback positions should the campaign encounter unexpected setbacks. The supply chain network stretched across dozens of systems. Bulk freighters hauled food, water, ammunition, fuel, and spare parts from production centers throughout the Imperium. Specialized vessels transported more sensitive cargo, plasma reactor components, Titan weapon systems, space marine gene seed stocks, and medical supplies. The Adeptus Munitorum established strict protocols for tracking shipments, ensuring that critical supplies reached their destinations on schedule. Convoy routes required constant adjustment, as intelligence reports revealed Orc raiding activity along certain paths. The timeframe for the muster extended across several months of the early 30th millennium. The Emperor's initial summons went out approximately around the year 0 of the 30th millennium, though exact dating remained imprecise due to the vagaries of warp travel and the Imperium's still developing calendar systems. The first legions to arrive began establishing their command posts and conducting preliminary reconnaissance operations. Later arrivals integrated into an increasingly complex command structure that spanned multiple star systems. The Emperor established his supreme headquarters aboard the massive flagship Bucephalus, a vessel that served as both warship and mobile command center. From this position, he would direct the overall campaign strategy while maintaining direct communication with his primarchs and senior commanders. The command structure reflected the Emperor's understanding that an operation of this magnitude required delegation of tactical authority while maintaining strategic unity. Each Primarch received responsibility for specific war zones and objectives, with the authority to command not only their own legion, but also assigned Imperial Army and Mechanicum forces. The strategic planning sessions brought together the greatest military minds in the Imperium. The Primarchs, each a genius in their own right, contributed their unique perspectives and expertise. Horus demonstrated his gift for understanding the broader strategic picture and coordinating complex multi-force operations. Dorn's defensive expertise proved valuable in planning the siege operations that would be necessary to reduce Orc strongholds. Guilliman's organizational abilities helped structure the command hierarchy and logistics networks. The Khan's understanding of mobile warfare influenced plans for rapid exploitation of breakthroughs. Each Primarch's input shaped the developing operational plans. The intelligence apparatus expanded dramatically to support the campaign. Scout ships probed Orc-held systems, gathering detailed information about enemy dispositions, fortifications, and fleet concentrations. Signals intelligence units intercepted and analyzed Orc communications, primitive though they were, looking for patterns that might reveal strategic intentions. Human agents, though unable to infiltrate Orc society directly, observed Greenskin activities from concealed positions on occupied worlds. The accumulated intelligence fed into a comprehensive picture of the enemy's capabilities and vulnerabilities. The psychological impact of the muster rippled throughout the Imperium. Worlds along the gathering routes witnessed the passage of the Emperor's forces, fleets that darkened the stars, armies that covered landing fields for kilometers in every direction, war machines that shook the ground with their passage. For populations that had only recently joined the Imperium, these displays demonstrated the true scale of humanity's resurgent power. For older Imperial worlds, the mobilization recalled the great campaigns of unification, when the Emperor had first brought order to Terra. The Space Marine legions conducted final training exercises and equipment checks. Veteran sergeants drilled their squads in urban combat techniques that would be necessary when fighting through Orc settlements. Armories issued fresh ammunition loads and conducted last-minute maintenance on bolters, chainswords, and heavier weapons. Apothecaries verified the integrity of gene seed stocks and prepared medical facilities for the casualties that would inevitably come. Tech Marines blessed machine spirits and performed final diagnostic rituals on vehicles and aircraft. The Imperial Army regiments underwent similar preparations, though on a vastly larger scale. Millions of soldiers received briefings on Orc physiology and tactics. Commissars emphasized discipline and courage in the face of the Greenskin threat. Regimental commanders studied the terrain data from target worlds, planning how their forces would deploy and maneuver. Artillery officers calculated firing solutions for engaging Orc fortifications. Tank commanders familiarized themselves with the capabilities and weaknesses of Orc armored vehicles. The Titan legions performed the most elaborate preparation rituals. Each god machine required days of ceremonies to awaken its machine spirit and prepare it for war. Princeps underwent neural interface calibration, synchronizing their minds with their Titan systems. Moderati crew members practiced their coordination, ensuring smooth operation of weapons and locomotion systems. Tech priests chanted litanies of function and blessed each system component. The Titans' war horns sounded across the assembly areas, their deep notes carrying for dozens of kilometers and announcing that the Omnissiah's wrath would soon fall upon the enemies of mankind. The choice of Horus Lupercal as the first Warmaster represented no surprise to those who had followed the Great Crusade's progress across the galaxy. By the time the Ullanor muster began, Horus had already distinguished himself as the most successful of the Emperor's sons in terms of worlds brought into compliance, battles won, and military operations successfully concluded. His record spoke for itself. The 16th Legion had participated in more campaigns than any other, and their victory count exceeded even the massive tallies accumulated by larger legions like the Ultramarines. This achievement stemmed not from reckless aggression or wasteful expenditure of resources, but from Horus's fundamental understanding of warfare at every level, from grand strategy to squad-level tactics. The Primarch's early campaigns had established patterns that would define his approach throughout the Great Crusade. When reunited with his legion, Horus had immediately grasped the capabilities and limitations of Space Marine warfare. Unlike some of his brothers who focused exclusively on the superhuman abilities of the Legion's Astartes, Horus understood that even Space Marines operated within a broader military context. His campaigns integrated Legion forces with Imperial Army units, fleet assets, and Mechanicum support in ways that maximized the strengths of each component. The pacification of the Severadan systems demonstrated this approach. Horus had used his Luna Wolves as a precision instrument, striking at key targets, while Imperial Army forces secured territory and maintained order among newly compliant populations. The conquest of Murder, a world infested by a particularly vicious Xenos species called the Megarachnid, showcased Horus's tactical flexibility. The initial assault had gone poorly, with the 140th Expeditionary Fleet suffering significant casualties against an enemy that proved far more formidable than anticipated. Rather than simply committing more forces to a grinding attritional campaign, Horus had analyzed the enemy's behavior patterns and biological characteristics. He identified their central hive structures as critical nodes in their command system and organized targeted strikes by elite units to decapitate their leadership. The campaign that might have dragged on for months concluded in weeks, with acceptable casualty rates and minimal damage to the world's infrastructure. His handling of the Keelakid campaign further demonstrated his grasp of combined arms warfare. The Keelakid system contained multiple inhabited worlds, each with its own military forces and political structures. Rather than conducting separate campaigns against each world, Horus orchestrated a simultaneous multi-world assault that prevented the enemy from concentrating their forces or providing mutual support. Luna Wolves' strike forces hit command centers and communications hubs on each world within hours of each other. Fleet elements interdicted orbital space, cutting off escape routes and preventing reinforcement. Imperial Army units followed up the Space Marine assaults, securing population centers and establishing Imperial authority. The entire system fell within a standard Terran month, a feat that military analysts considered remarkable given the distances involved and the coordination required. Horus's relationship with the Imperial Army, forces under his command, set him apart from many of his brothers. Some Primarchs viewed mortal soldiers as expendable assets or necessary, but inferior auxiliaries to the Legion's Astartes. Horus understood that the Imperial Army represented humanity's primary military instrument, and that Space Marines, for all their capabilities, could not garrison worlds or provide the sustained presence necessary for long-term compliance. He made a point of meeting with Imperial Army commanders, learning their capabilities and concerns. His orders to mortal forces came with clear objectives and the resources necessary to accomplish them. Army officers who served under Horus's overall command consistently reported that they felt valued and understood, that their input received consideration, and that their casualties were not wasted in futile gestures. The Primarch's ability to inspire extended beyond mere charisma, though he possessed that quality in abundance. Horus demonstrated a genuine interest in the individuals who served under him, from Legion captains to army privates. He remembered names, recognized achievements, and acknowledged sacrifices. When visiting forward positions, he spoke with common soldiers, asking about their experiences and concerns. These interactions were not mere propaganda exercises. Horus genuinely listened and often implemented suggestions that came from unexpected sources. A tank commander's observation about terrain conditions might influence operational planning. A scout's report about enemy patrol patterns could reshape assault timetables. This willingness to accept input from all levels of the command structure created an atmosphere where initiative and intelligence were rewarded regardless of rank. His tactical brilliance manifested in his ability to read battlefields and adapt to changing circumstances. During the compliance action against the Oreshan technocracy, Horus had planned a conventional assault on their primary fortress city. When his scouts reported unexpected defensive preparations that would have made the planned approach costly, Horus immediately revised his strategy. He redirected his main force to a secondary objective, while a smaller Luna Wolves contingent conducted a diversionary assault that drew the enemy's attention. The main force then struck from an unexpected direction, achieving breakthrough before the defenders could reposition. This kind of tactical flexibility required not only quick thinking, but also a command structure responsive enough to implement rapid changes without confusion or breakdown in coordination. The Luna Wolves themselves reflected their Primarch's character and methods. The 16th Legion had developed a reputation as the Emperor's premier assault force, the formation called upon when a campaign required swift, decisive action. Their combat doctrine emphasized aggressive maneuver, rapid exploitation of enemy weaknesses, and the application of overwhelming force at critical points. Luna Wolves companies trained extensively in boarding actions, drop pod assaults, and urban combat, the environments where Space Marines held the greatest advantages over conventional forces. The Legion's kill teams specialized in decapitation strikes against enemy leadership, a tactic that Horus employed frequently to collapse enemy resistance without the need for prolonged campaigns. The Legion's organization reflected Horus's understanding of operational flexibility. While maintaining the standard company structure common to all legions, the Luna Wolves organized their forces into larger operational groups that could function independently for extended periods. These groups combined tactical companies with supporting elements, armor, artillery, reconnaissance units, and specialized troops, creating self-sufficient battle forces capable of prosecuting entire campaigns without external support. This organizational approach allowed Horus to conduct multiple simultaneous operations across vast distances, multiplying the Legion's effective combat power. Equipment and logistics received particular attention from Horus and his senior officers. The Luna Wolves maintained their wargear to exacting standards, understanding that equipment failures in combat could prove fatal. The Legion's armories stockpiled ammunition, spare parts, and replacement weapons in quantities that some other legions considered excessive. This logistical emphasis paid dividends during extended campaigns where supply lines stretched thin. Luna Wolves' forces could maintain combat operations longer than comparable units from other legions, simply because they had the supplies necessary to sustain themselves. The relationship between Horus and the Emperor formed the foundation of the Primarch's eventual elevation to Warmaster. From their first meeting, when the Emperor had discovered his lost son on Thonia, a bond had formed that went beyond the genetic connection between creator and creation. The Emperor recognized in Horus not just a brilliant military commander, but a son who truly understood his vision for humanity. Their conversations ranged far beyond military matters, touching on philosophy, governance, and the future shape of the Imperium. Horus grasped the broader purpose of the Great Crusade in ways that some of his brothers did not. He understood that conquest was merely the first step in a longer process of bringing humanity together under a unified government and culture. This understanding manifested in how Horus conducted compliance operations. Where some Primarchs focused solely on military victory, Horus considered the aftermath. He worked with remembrancers and imperial administrators to ensure that newly compliant worlds received the support necessary to integrate into the Imperium. He advocated for reasonable tithe levels that wouldn't cripple developing economies. He argued for cultural sensitivity where possible, preserving local traditions that didn't conflict with imperial doctrine. These efforts reflected his comprehension that the Imperium's long-term stability depended on willing cooperation from its member worlds, not just military occupation. Among his brother Primarchs, Horus occupied a unique position. His personality combined confidence without arrogance, strength without brutality, and ambition without selfishness in ways that earned respect even from brothers whose temperaments differed greatly from his own. Rogel Dorn, whose stern demeanor and rigid adherence to duty sometimes created friction with other Primarchs, worked smoothly with Horus. The two had coordinated multiple joint operations, with Dorn's defensive expertise complementing Horus's offensive capabilities. Sanguinius, perhaps the most beloved of the Primarchs, considered Horus a close friend and confidant. Their relationship went beyond professional respect into genuine brotherhood. Even Primarchs whose methods diverged significantly from Horus's approach recognized his abilities. Angron, whose World Eaters had embraced increasingly brutal tactics, acknowledged Horus's combat prowess and strategic acumen. Mortarion, whose Death Guard specialized in attritional warfare that ground down enemies through relentless pressure, respected Horus's results even when their methods differed. Perdurabo, often bitter about perceived slights and lack of recognition, viewed Horus as one of the few brothers who properly appreciated the Iron Warrior's contributions to the Great Crusade. This ability to maintain positive relationships across the full spectrum of Primarch personalities demonstrated diplomatic skills that matched Horus's military talents. The Ullanor Campaign provided the stage for Horus to demonstrate all these capabilities on an unprecedented scale. As the various legions, Imperial army forces, and Mechanicum contingents converged on the assembly points, Horus coordinated their integration into a unified command structure. The Emperor maintained supreme command, but increasingly delegated operational authority to Horus for specific sectors and objectives. This delegation reflected the Emperor's confidence in his son's abilities and served as an extended test of Horus's capacity to command forces far larger than a single legion. Horus's planning for the Ullanor assault incorporated lessons from decades of campaigning. He understood that the Orcs' numerical superiority meant that Imperial forces could not simply overwhelm them through direct assault. Instead, the campaign required careful coordination of multiple simultaneous operations that would prevent the Orcs from concentrating their forces. Naval elements would establish orbital superiority, cutting off Orc reinforcements and supply lines. Titan legions would engage the massive Gargants in direct combat, neutralizing the Orcs' most powerful weapons. Space Marine forces would conduct precision strikes against command nodes and strategic targets. Imperial army formations would secure territory and maintain pressure across broad fronts. Each element of this plan required precise timing and coordination, exactly the kind of complex operation at which Horus excelled. The Imperial fleet translated from the warp at the edge of the Ullanor system in a display of coordinated might that few observers would ever witness. Thousands of vessels emerged from the Immaterium across multiple translation points, their arrival timed to within minutes of each other despite the vagaries of warp travel. The fleet's composition reflected the accumulated naval power of humanity's resurgent empire, battleships whose lance batteries could crack continents, cruisers bristling with weapons batteries and torpedo tubes, escort squadrons that numbered in the hundreds, and the massive transport vessels that carried the invasion force. The sheer mass of so many ships emerging simultaneously created gravitational distortions that registered on augur arrays throughout the system. Admiral Yanis Kord, commanding the naval elements from his flagship Monarch of Fire, immediately began deploying the fleet into predetermined formations. The battle plan called for a multi-layered approach that would isolate Ullanor Prime from potential reinforcement while establishing the orbital superiority necessary for ground operations. Heavy battleships and cruisers formed the core battle line, their thick armor and powerful weapons designed to engage the largest Orc vessels. Lighter cruisers and destroyer squadrons positioned themselves to intercept Orc attack craft and raiders. Specialized bombardment vessels moved into positions that would allow them to support ground operations once orbital space was secured. The Orc response came with characteristic speed and aggression. Augur stations detected massive energy signatures throughout the system as Orc vessels powered up their reactors and engaged their drives. The Greenskin fleet had been dispersed across multiple orbital stations and planetary moorings, but they began converging toward the Imperial forces with remarkable coordination. Orc kill cruisers, massive vessels that combined crude construction with surprising firepower, led the advance. Behind them came swarms of smaller craft, escorts, raiders, and attack ships that the Orcs had assembled in their orbital yards. Intelligence estimates had predicted substantial Orc naval forces, but the actual numbers exceeded even pessimistic projections. Thousands of Orc vessels began moving to intercept the Imperial fleet. The naval engagement that followed tested the Imperial fleet's cohesion and tactical doctrine. Orc vessels closed at maximum acceleration, their commanders showing none of the caution that typically characterized void warfare. The Greenskins relied on their ships' heavy forward armor and powerful ramming prows, seeking to close to ranges where their shorter-ranged but devastating weapons could tear into Imperial hulls. Admiral Kord maintained fleet discipline, ordering his battle line to hold formation and engage at range with lance strikes and torpedo spreads. The void lit up with weapons fire as the two fleets collided. Imperial gunnery superiority became apparent in the opening exchanges. Lance batteries reached out across hundreds of thousands of kilometers, their coherent energy beams punching through Orc armor and vaporizing internal systems. Torpedo spreads launched from cruiser broadside tubes tracked toward Orc capital ships, their plasma warheads detonating against shields and hulls. The Orcs returned fire with their own weapons, massive cannons that hurled shells the size of HAB blocks, crude but effective missile batteries, and energy weapons of uncertain design that nonetheless proved capable of damaging Imperial vessels. Several escort ships disappeared in expanding clouds of plasma as Orc fire found vulnerable points. The battle spread across millions of cubic kilometers as squadron-level engagements developed throughout the engagement zone. Imperial destroyer squadrons engaged Orc raider packs in running battles that tested the skill of both sides' helmsmen. The destroyers relied on speed and maneuverability, using their superior engines to maintain optimal firing positions while avoiding the Orcs' heavier weapons. The Greenskin raiders compensated with sheer numbers and reckless aggression, accepting horrific casualties to close with their targets. When Orc vessels did manage to close to boarding range, their crews launched themselves at Imperial ships with savage enthusiasm. Several Imperial escorts found themselves fighting off Orc boarding parties while simultaneously engaging external threats. The Orc rock fortresses presented a different challenge entirely. These massive installations, built from hollowed-out asteroids and equipped with batteries of heavy weapons, occupied strategic positions throughout the system. Each rock mounted firepower equivalent to a capital ship, while possessing the structural integrity of a small moon. Imperial forces could not simply bypass them. The rocks commanded key orbital approaches and transit routes that the invasion would require. Specialized assault groups, built around heavy battleships and supported by bomber squadrons, began the methodical work of reducing these fortresses. The assault on rock fortress designation Gamma 7 demonstrated the challenges involved. The fortress occupied a position in high orbit above Ullanor Prime, its weapons covering the primary landing zones identified for the ground assault. A battle group centered on the Apocalypse-class battleship Righteous Fury approached the rock, its void shields at maximum strength and its weapons crews at battle stations. The rock opened fire at extreme range, its crude but powerful cannons hurling massive shells toward the Imperial vessels. The Righteous Fury's shields flared as impacts registered, the ship's reactors straining to maintain defensive integrity. The battleship closed steadily, its lance batteries returning fire with measured precision. Each lance strike carved molten gouges in the rock's surface, vaporizing weapon emplacements and sensor arrays. Bomber squadrons from the carrier Illustrious made attack runs against identified weak points, their payloads of plasma bombs and melta torpedoes digging deep into the asteroid's structure. The rock's defensive fire intensified, filling space with explosive shells and energy blasts. Several bombers disappeared in fireballs as Orc gunners found their marks. The engagement dragged on for hours as the Imperial forces systematically dismantled the fortress's offensive capabilities. Similar battles played out across the system as Imperial forces engaged each rock fortress in turn. The attack moon installations presented even greater challenges. These were not asteroids but actual moons that the Orcs had converted into mobile fortresses, equipped with massive engines that allowed them to maneuver within the system. Each attack moon carried weapons that dwarfed anything mounted on conventional vessels, cannons the size of city blocks, missile silos that could launch hundreds of warheads simultaneously, and energy weapons that drew power from the moon's core. The destruction of even a single attack moon required the concentrated firepower of multiple battle groups and often resulted in significant Imperial casualties. While the naval battle raged in orbit, the first ground forces began their descent to Ullanor Prime. The initial assault plan called for establishing multiple beachheads across the planet's surface, preventing the Orcs from concentrating their forces against a single landing zone. Drop pod assaults by Space Marine forces preceded the main landings, targeting key defensive positions and creating zones of chaos in the Orc lines. Thousands of drop pods screamed through the atmosphere, their retro thrusters firing at the last moment to arrest their descent. Space Marines emerged from the pods into immediate combat, their bolters firing before the hatches had fully opened. the Imperial Fists landed in the Northern Hemisphere, targeting a region designated as Landing Zone Primus. The zone encompassed several hundred square kilometers of relatively flat terrain that intelligence had identified as suitable for establishing a fortified base. The 7th Legion's drop pods came down in precise patterns, each company landing in positions that allowed them to provide mutual support. Within minutes of touchdown, Imperial Fist squads were advancing on pre-designated objectives, orc gun emplacements, command bunkers, and communications towers. The orcs responded with typical ferocity, pouring fire into the landing zones from prepared positions. Captain Kamba Diaz of the 3rd Company led his warriors against an orc strongpoint that dominated the eastern approaches to the landing zone. The position consisted of a reinforced bunker complex mounting multiple heavy weapons, surrounded by trench lines filled with orc infantry. Diaz's tactical assessment identified the bunker as the key to breaking orc resistance in the sector. He organized his assault in textbook fashion. Heavy weapons squads established fire superiority, suppressing the orc defenders while assault squads maneuvered to flanking positions. The Imperial Fists advanced under covering fire, their power armor absorbing hits from orc shootas and sluggas that would have killed unarmored humans. The assault squads hit the orc trenches from 2 directions simultaneously, their chainswords and bolt pistols reaping a terrible toll. Orcs fought with savage determination, accepting horrific casualties without retreating. The Greenskins' physical toughness meant that even mortal wounds often failed to stop them immediately. Orcs continued fighting with limbs severed and organs destroyed, dying only when their primitive biology finally succumbed to accumulated damage. Imperial Fist squads methodically cleared each trench section, their discipline and coordination overwhelming the orcs' individual ferocity. The White Scars executed a different approach in their designated landing zones across the planet's equatorial regions. The 5th Legion specialized in rapid maneuver warfare, and their assault reflected this doctrine. Rather than establishing static beachheads, the White Scars landed in dispersed formations and immediately began mobile operations. Bike squadrons and land speeder units ranged ahead of the main force, striking at orc positions and withdrawing before the Greenskins could organize effective responses. This approach created confusion in the orc command structure, forcing them to respond to threats across a broad front rather than concentrating against specific targets. Khan Jagatai personally led the initial assault, his command squad dropping directly into a zone thick with orc forces. The Primarch's presence inspired his warriors to extraordinary efforts. White Scars squads pushed deep into orc-held territory, their speed and aggression catching the Greenskins off balance. The Legion's doctrine emphasized exploitation of enemy weaknesses rather than direct confrontation with strength. When White Scars encountered heavy orc resistance, they disengaged and sought alternate routes rather than becoming bogged down in attritional combat. The Blood Angels landed in the Southern Hemisphere. Their assault focused on a massive orc industrial complex that intelligence had identified as a major weapons production facility. The 9th Legion's drop pods came down amid a forest of factory towers and forged structures, the air thick with toxic fumes and the heat of countless furnaces. Orcs swarmed from the factories in enormous numbers, their proximity to their war machines meaning they could respond to the Imperial assault within minutes. The Blood Angels found themselves fighting in close quarters amid the industrial structures, exactly the kind of environment where their assault-focused doctrine proved most effective. Sanguinius led from the front, his presence on the battlefield serving as a beacon for his sons. The Primarch's wings carried him above the fighting, allowing him to observe the tactical situation and direct his forces to critical points. Blood Angels' assault squads followed their father's example, using jump packs to maneuver vertically through the industrial complex's 3-dimensional terrain. The fighting grew intense as orcs poured reinforcements into the battle. The Blood Angels met the Green Tide with controlled fury, their training and discipline channeling their aggression into devastating combat effectiveness. The main Imperial Army landings began once the Space Marine forces had secured initial beachheads. Massive transport vessels descended through the atmosphere, their holds filled with tanks, artillery pieces, and millions of soldiers. The transports landed under covering fire from Space Marine positions, their ramps dropping to disgorge regiment after regiment of Imperial Army troops. Tank companies rolled off the transports and immediately moved to designated positions, their commanders following pre-planned deployment schedules. Artillery batteries established firing positions and began ranging their weapons against Orc concentrations identified by forward observers. The Orcs responded to the Imperial landings with characteristic aggression. Counter-attacks developed across every beachhead as Greenskin mobs charged toward the Imperial positions. The Orcs came in waves that seemed endless, their numbers replenished from the vast populations that infested Ullanor Prime. Orc boys armed with choppas and sluggas advanced in loose mobs, their discipline non-existent but their ferocity undeniable. Behind them came heavier forces, knobs in mega armor, meganobs wielding power claws and heavy weapons, and mobs of stormboys using crude jump packs to bound forward in great leaps. The Imperial defenders met these assaults with disciplined firepower. Imperial Army infantry opened up with lasguns and heavy weapons, their volleys cutting down Orcs by the hundreds. The Greenskins' tough physiology meant that single lasgun hits often failed to kill, but concentrated fire from entire platoons could bring down even the largest Orcs. Artillery batteries fired over the heads of the infantry, their shells falling among the Orc mobs and creating zones of devastation. Tank squadrons engaged Orc vehicles that attempted to support the infantry assaults, their main guns and las cannons punching through the crude armor of Orc trucks and battle wagons. The fighting intensified as the Orcs committed heavier assets to their counter-attacks. Gargants appeared on the horizon, their massive forms visible from kilometers away. These towering war machines stood as tall as Imperial warlord titans, their crude construction belying their devastating firepower. Each Gargant mounted dozens of weapons, massive cannons, missile launchers, energy weapons of uncertain design, and close combat weapons like enormous chain claws and power fists. The Gargants advanced toward Imperial positions with ground-shaking steps, their weapons firing at maximum rate. The Mechanicum's Titan legions moved to engage these threats. Warlord Titans from Legio Mortis and Legio Ignatum took up positions in the Imperial lines, their god machines towering over the surrounding forces. The engagement between Titans and Gargants became battles of mobile fortresses, each machine trading fire at ranges measured in kilometers. Titan plasma weapons superheated the air as they discharged, their beams capable of melting through meters of armor. Gargant weapons responded with their own devastating firepower, shells and energy blasts hammering against Titan void shields. The grinding advance through Orc-held territory began as Imperial forces pushed out from their beachheads. Every kilometer gained came at a cost measured in lives and equipment. The Orcs had fortified their holdings extensively, creating defense lines that incorporated natural terrain features with constructed positions. Bunker complexes built from scrap metal and rockcrete dotted the landscape, each mounting heavy weapons and garrisoned by Orc mobs that fought to the death. Trench systems zigzagged across open ground, providing covered approaches for Orc counterattacks. Minefields sown with crude but effective explosives channeled Imperial advances into killing zones. Imperial forces adapted their tactics to the conditions they encountered. Combined arms teams coordinated infantry, armor, and artillery to reduce Orc positions systematically. Engineers cleared minefields under covering fire, marking safe paths for advancing forces. Tanks provided direct fire support, their main guns engaging bunkers and strongpoints at close range. Infantry squads assaulted cleared positions, rooting out surviving defenders and securing ground. The process repeated across hundreds of fronts as Imperial forces expanded their control. The Orcs' energy reached its peak intensity during these battles. The Greenskins fought with fanatical determination, their psychic gestalt consciousness driving them to ever greater acts of violence. Orc mobs that should have broken under Imperial firepower instead pressed forward, accepting casualties that would have shattered any other army. The Wa field generated by billions of Orcs created a psychic pressure that Imperial psychers could feel like physical weight. Some reported visions of a vast green tide washing across the galaxy, an apocalyptic future where Orcs overwhelmed all opposition through sheer numbers and savage will. The Emperor's personal involvement in the Ullanor Campaign represented a departure from his usual strategic approach during the Great Crusade. Since the discovery and deployment of his Primarchs, the Master of Mankind had increasingly withdrawn from direct battlefield command, focusing instead on the broader coordination of the Imperium's expansion and the mysterious project beneath the Imperial Palace that consumed much of his attention. His choice to personally lead the Ullanor Campaign, therefore, carried profound significance, signaling to all observers that this conflict represented a critical juncture in humanity's resurgence. The Emperor understood that the destruction of Urlakk Urg's empire required not just military victory, but a demonstration of imperial power that would resonate across the galaxy. The Bucephalus served as the nerve center for the entire campaign, its command decks housing the most sophisticated strategic coordination systems available to the Imperium. The flagship dwarfed even the largest battleships in the Imperial fleet, its hull measuring over 15 kilometers in length and mounting weapons batteries that could level continents. The vessel's internal structure contained not just military facilities, but entire sections dedicated to administration, logistics coordination, and the housing of the massive staff required to manage an operation of this scale. Astropathic choirs occupied shielded chambers deep within the ship, their minds linked in concert to maintain communications across the vast distances of the campaign zone. From the command throne aboard the Bucephalus, the Emperor directed operations across multiple star systems simultaneously. Strategic displays showed the disposition of forces throughout the Ullanor sector, each icon representing formations ranging from individual legion companies to entire Imperial Army corps. The Emperor's ability to process and synthesize information exceeded anything achievable by conventional commanders or even the most sophisticated logic engines. He absorbed reports from thousands of sources, identified patterns in enemy behavior, and issued orders that accounted for variables that would overwhelm lesser minds. His strategic vision operated on timescales that spanned weeks and months, anticipating enemy responses and positioning forces to exploit opportunities that had not yet materialized. The coordination of millions of warriors across system-wide battlefields required organizational systems that pushed the Imperium's administrative capabilities to their limits. The Emperor had established a command hierarchy that delegated tactical authority to his Primarchs while maintaining strategic unity of purpose. Each Primarch received responsibility for specific operational zones, with the authority to command not only their own legion, but also assigned Imperial Army formations and Mechanicum assets. This structure allowed for rapid decision-making at the tactical level, while ensuring that individual operations supported the broader strategic objectives. The Emperor monitored these operations constantly, intervening when necessary to redirect forces or adjust objectives in response to changing circumstances. The tactical councils held aboard the Bucephalus brought together the greatest military minds in the Imperium. The Primarchs gathered in the ship's Strategium, a vast chamber dominated by hololithic displays that showed the campaign's progress in real time. The Emperor presided over these councils, his presence commanding absolute attention despite his typically measured demeanor. The discussions ranged across every aspect of the campaign: logistics concerns, tactical assessments of enemy capabilities, proposals for new operational approaches, and evaluations of ongoing battles. Each Primarch contributed their unique perspective, their individual genius shaped by their distinct personalities and experiences. Horus demonstrated his gift for seeing the broader strategic picture, identifying how seemingly disconnected operations could be coordinated to create cascading effects throughout the Orc Empire. His proposals often involved complex multi-phase operations that required precise timing and coordination between multiple forces. The Emperor listened to these suggestions with evident interest, occasionally asking questions that probed the assumptions underlying Horus's plans. The interaction between father and son revealed the depth of understanding that existed between them. Horus grasped not just the military objectives, but the political and psychological dimensions of the campaign, recognizing that the Ullanor victory needed to inspire compliance and loyalty throughout the Imperium. Rogal Dorn's contributions focused on the siege operations necessary to reduce Orc fortress complexes. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists possessed an instinctive understanding of fortification and siege warfare that bordered on supernatural. He analyzed the structural characteristics of Orc defenses, identifying weak points that could be exploited and recommending approaches that would minimize Imperial casualties while ensuring complete destruction of enemy positions. Dorn's assessments sometimes clashed with more aggressive proposals from his brothers, particularly when he advocated for methodical approaches that would take longer but result in fewer losses. The Emperor generally supported Dorn's conservative estimates, valuing the preservation of Imperial forces over speed of conquest. Jagatai Khan brought his expertise in mobile warfare to the councils, proposing rapid exploitation operations that would bypass Orc strongpoints and strike at their logistics networks. The Khan's approach emphasized speed and flexibility, using fast-moving forces to create chaos in enemy rear areas, while heavier formations fixed Orc attention along the front lines. His proposals often involved accepting calculated risks, trading security for momentum in ways that made some of his more cautious brothers uncomfortable. The Emperor recognized the value in the Khan's approach, particularly for operations aimed at disrupting Orc coordination and preventing them from massing their forces effectively. Sanguinius contributed insights drawn from his legion's experience fighting in complex urban and industrial environments. The Blood Angels had encountered some of the heaviest Orc resistance during their assaults on manufacturing complexes, and Sanguinius shared tactical lessons about fighting in three-dimensional terrain where conventional doctrine proved inadequate. His observations about Orc behavior under extreme pressure, their tendency to fight harder when cornered rather than retreating, influenced planning for the final assault on Urlakk Urg's stronghold. The Emperor valued Sanguinius's input not just for its tactical merit, but for the Primarch's ability to maintain morale and inspiration among forces facing brutal combat conditions. The Emperor's assessment of his son's capabilities extended beyond their purely military skills. He observed how they interacted with each other, noting which Primarchs worked well together and which combinations created friction. Horus and Sanguinius demonstrated natural synergy, their forces coordinating smoothly and their command styles complementing each other. Dorn and the Lion operated effectively together despite their different approaches, mutual respect overcoming potential conflicts. The Emperor filed these observations away, recognizing that the success of future campaigns would depend on his ability to assign Primarchs to operations where their particular talents and temperaments would prove most effective. The rare occasions when the Emperor personally took to the battlefield became the subject of intense documentation by the remembrancers attached to the campaign. These artists, writers, and imagists had received strict instructions to record the campaign for posterity, creating a comprehensive record that would inspire loyalty and demonstrate imperial might to populations throughout the galaxy. When word spread that the Emperor himself would lead an assault, remembrancers competed for positions that would allow them to witness and document the event. The resulting accounts, though filtered through the limitations of mortal perception and the remembrancers' tendency toward aggrandizement, provided glimpses of the Master of Mankind's capabilities in direct combat. The assault on the Orc fortress complex designated target Sigma Prime demonstrated the Emperor's approach to personal combat. Intelligence had identified the complex as a major command center coordinating Orc operations across an entire continental region. The fortress occupied a plateau surrounded by steep cliffs, its approaches covered by overlapping fields of fire from dozens of weapon emplacements. Conventional assault would have required extensive preparatory bombardment and resulted in significant casualties. The Emperor chose a different approach, a direct assault by elite forces led by himself and accompanied by elements of the Legio Custodes. The Emperor descended from orbit aboard a Thunderhawk gunship, accompanied by a full company of custodian guard. The Golden Warriors represented the pinnacle of the Emperor's genetic craftsmanship, each one a work of art in both form and function. Their guardian spears and power weapons gleamed in the harsh light of Ullanor's sun as the Thunderhawk approached the fortress at high speed. Orc anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, shells and missiles tracking the incoming craft. The pilot executed evasive maneuvers that would have torn apart a lesser vessel, the Thunderhawk's frame groaning under the stress of high-speed turns and acceleration. The craft touched down on the fortress's outer wall, its assault ramp dropping before the landing gear had fully settled. The Emperor emerged first, the sword of the Emperor held in his right hand. The blade blazed with golden light, its edge capable of severing the bonds between atoms and unmaking matter at the molecular level. The weapon had been forged in ages past, its creation involving technologies and processes that even the Mechanicum could not fully replicate. In the Emperor's hands, the sword became an extension of his will, each strike precisely calculated to achieve maximum effect. Orcs swarmed toward the landing site, their numbers so great that they obscured the ground beneath their feet. The Emperor moved forward with measured steps, his movements economical and precise. The sword of the Emperor swept in arcs that seemed almost lazy in their execution, but each motion left devastation in its wake. Orcs died in groups, their bodies severed cleanly or simply ceasing to function as the blade's energies disrupted their biological processes. The Emperor's psychic might manifested as a corona of golden light that surrounded him, its brilliance painful to observe directly. Orcs that came too close to this aura simply collapsed, their primitive nervous systems overwhelmed by psychic pressure that crushed their consciousness. The Custodian Guard advanced in perfect formation around their master, their guardian spears reaping a terrible toll among the Orc defenders. Each Custodian fought with skill that exceeded even Space Marine capabilities, their movements coordinated through a level of training and genetic enhancement that produced warriors of unmatched lethality. The Custodians required no orders or coordination. Each warrior understood their role instinctively and adapted to changing circumstances without conscious thought. They formed a protective cordon around the Emperor, ensuring that no threat could reach him, while he focused his attention on larger strategic objectives. The Emperor's psychic abilities manifested in ways that defied conventional understanding. Orc mobs charging toward his position found their weapons malfunctioning, their crude firearms exploding in their hands or simply refusing to fire. Orc vehicles approaching the battle lost power, their engines dying despite having functioned moments before. The psychic pressure emanating from the Emperor created zones where the Orcs' own energy turned against them, their collective psychic field collapsing under the weight of a will infinitely greater than their own. Some Orcs simply stopped fighting, their limited minds unable to process the presence before them, standing motionless until Custodian blades ended their existence. The advance through the fortress complex demonstrated the Emperor's tactical acumen at the small unit level. He identified the fortress's command center with unerring accuracy, leading his forces along the most direct route despite the complex's labyrinthine layout. Orc defenders attempted to establish blocking positions at choke points and intersections, but the Emperor's forces swept through these obstacles with minimal delay. When the Custodians encountered particularly heavy resistance, the Emperor would step forward and unleash psychic attacks that cleared entire corridors in seconds. Walls of golden fire swept through Orc positions, the flames burning with such intensity that even Orc physiology could not withstand them. The final confrontation occurred in the fortress's central command chamber, a vast space filled with crude but functional communications equipment and tactical displays. The Orc warboss commanding the facility, a massive specimen even by Greenskin standards, led his elite bodyguard in a desperate last stand. The warboss wielded a power claw of exceptional size and quality, its energy field crackling with barely contained power. His bodyguards included mega-armored knobs and a handful of Orc weirdboys whose psychic abilities made them dangerous opponents even for Custodians. The Emperor engaged the warboss directly, while his Custodians dealt with the bodyguards. The Orc's power claw swept toward the Emperor's head with surprising speed, the weapon capable of crushing even Terminator armor with a single blow. The Emperor sidestepped the attack with minimal movement, his response a single thrust that drove the sword of the Emperor through the Orc's chest. The blade's energies detonated within the warboss's body, the resulting explosion reducing the massive Greenskin to component atoms. The bodyguards died moments later, their resistance collapsing once their leader fell. The destruction of the command center sent ripples through Orc operations across the entire region. Without central coordination, Orc forces lost cohesion and began operating independently. This fragmentation allowed Imperial forces to defeat them in detail, reducing what had been a coordinated defensive network into isolated pockets that could be eliminated systematically. The Emperor's personal intervention had achieved in hours what conventional assault might have required days or weeks to accomplish, demonstrating the force multiplication effect of his direct involvement. The propaganda value of the Emperor's battlefield appearances exceeded even their immediate tactical impact. Remembrancers produced thousands of images and written accounts describing the master of mankind in combat, each one emphasizing his invincibility and divine power. These works circulated throughout the Imperium, reaching worlds that had only recently achieved compliance and populations that had never seen the Emperor in person. The message was clear and intentional. The Imperium possessed power beyond mortal comprehension, led by a being whose capabilities transcended human limitations. Resistance was futile. Compliance offered the only path to survival and prosperity. The Emperor understood the psychological dimensions of warfare as thoroughly as he understood its physical aspects. The Ullanor Campaign served multiple purposes beyond the immediate objective of destroying the Orc Empire. It demonstrated to potential enemies throughout the galaxy that the Imperium could marshal overwhelming force when necessary. It showed newly compliant worlds that their integration into the Imperium offered protection from threats they could not face alone. It proved to the Imperial military itself that no enemy, regardless of their numbers or ferocity, could withstand humanity's united strength under proper leadership. The convergence of 8 complete Space Marine legions on Ullanor represented the largest concentration of Primarch-led forces in the history of the Great Crusade. The sheer diversity of tactical doctrines, combat philosophies, and command styles created both opportunities and challenges for the campaign's coordination. Each Primarch brought decades of experience conquering worlds across the galaxy, yet their methods differed so dramatically that integrating their operations required careful planning and constant communication. The Emperor's decision to assign specific operational zones to each Primarch allowed them to employ their preferred tactics while ensuring their efforts supported the broader strategic objectives. Horus Lupercal commanded the largest operational sector, a testament to both his proven capabilities and the Emperor's confidence in his eldest found son. The Luna Wolves deployed across a broad front in the northern territories of Ullanor Prime, their objective the destruction of several major Orc industrial complexes that fed the Greenskin war machine. Horus coordinated not just his own legion, but also substantial Imperial army formations and supporting Mechanicum assets. His command post processed information from hundreds of sources simultaneously, with staff officers tracking the movements of forces spread across thousands of square kilometers. Horus demonstrated his gift for seeing patterns in the chaos of battle, identifying opportunities to exploit Orc weaknesses before the Greenskins themselves recognized their vulnerabilities. The Luna Wolves' assault doctrine emphasized aggressive maneuver and the application of overwhelming force at decisive points. Companies advanced in coordinated waves, each supporting the others through carefully timed movements. When Luna Wolves encountered heavy resistance, they did not simply batter themselves against Orc defenses, but instead probed for weak points and shifted their axis of advance to exploit them. This flexibility required junior officers capable of independent decision-making and a command structure responsive enough to implement rapid changes without confusion. Horus had spent years developing these capabilities within his legion, and the results showed in their consistent success across diverse operational environments. Rogel Dorn's Imperial Fists operated in stark contrast to the Luna Wolves' mobile approach. The 7th Legion received assignment to reduce the most heavily fortified Orc positions, fortress complexes that intelligence assessed would require months of siege operations to overcome through conventional assault. Dorn approached these challenges with methodical precision, his forces establishing siege lines that completely isolated each target before beginning reduction operations. Imperial Fist's engineering companies constructed counter-fortifications that protected besieging forces from Orc counterattacks while providing platforms for heavy weapons and artillery. The Siege of Fortress Complex designation, Kappa 9, demonstrated Dorne's approach in detail. The complex occupied a natural strongpoint in mountainous terrain, its defenses incorporating both the landscape's inherent advantages and extensive Orc construction. Massive walls built from scrap metal and rockcrete surrounded the inner fortress, their surfaces studded with weapon emplacements and observation posts. Dorne spent days analyzing the fortress's structure, identifying load-bearing elements and weak points in the defensive layout. His assault plan called for systematic destruction of the outer defenses through concentrated artillery bombardment, followed by breaching operations at carefully selected points. Imperial Fist's artillery batteries established firing positions on surrounding heights, their guns ranging in on pre-designated targets. The bombardment began at dawn, hundreds of guns firing in coordinated salvos that walked across the Orc defenses. Dorne personally directed the fire missions, adjusting targeting based on observed results and intelligence updates. The bombardment continued for 3 full days, pausing only to allow gun crews rest and to replenish ammunition stocks. By the time Dorne ordered the assault, large sections of the outer wall had been reduced to rubble, and most of the Orc weapon emplacements had been destroyed or abandoned. The breached teams advanced under covering fire from heavy weapons squads positioned in the siege lines. Imperial Fist's Terminators led the assault, their tactical dreadnought armor-proof against most Orc weapons. The Terminators cleared the breach zones with storm bolter fire and power fist strikes, creating space for tactical squads to follow. The assault proceeded with mechanical efficiency, each squad knowing their objectives and executing them without need for constant direction. Within hours, Imperial Fist's forces had secured the outer defenses and begun advancing into the fortress interior. Jagatai Khan's White Scars pursued an entirely different operational concept. The 5th Legion specialized in lightning warfare, using speed and mobility to strike at targets across vast distances before the enemy could respond effectively. The Khan divided his legion into multiple fast-moving columns, each built around bike squadrons and land speeder units supported by mechanized infantry in rhino transports. These columns ranged across the equatorial regions of Ullanor Prime, avoiding major Orc concentrations while striking at logistics nodes, supply depots, and communications facilities. The White Scars approach created chaos in the Orc command structure. Greenskin warbosses found their supply lines severed, their communications disrupted, and their rear areas under constant attack. When Orcs attempted to concentrate forces to deal with White Scars incursions, the 5th Legion simply disengaged and struck elsewhere. This constant movement prevented the Orcs from fixing the White Scars in place long enough to bring their numerical superiority to bear. The Khan personally led several deep penetration raids, his command squad appearing dozens of kilometers behind Orc lines to destroy critical targets before withdrawing at high speed. One such raid targeted an Orc fuel depot that supplied armored formations across an entire sector. Intelligence had identified the depot's location, but assessed that conventional assault would require substantial forces and result in heavy casualties due to the depot's defenses. The Khan proposed a different approach, a rapid strike by a single company supported by his command squad, hitting the target at dawn when Orc vigilance would be lowest. The raid force covered over 100 kilometers during the night, their bikes and speeders moving at maximum velocity across broken terrain. The assault lasted less than 20 minutes. White Scars bike squads swept through the depot's perimeter defenses, their bolters and special weapons cutting down surprised Orc guards. The Khan's command squad struck directly at the fuel storage tanks, planting melta charges that would trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. The White Scars withdrew before the Orcs could organize effective resistance, and the depot exploded in a fireball visible from orbit. The destruction of the fuel stocks immobilized hundreds of Orc vehicles and forced the Greenskins to redirect resources to establishing new supply networks. Sanguinius and his Blood Angels operated in the southern industrial zones, where Orc manufacturing complexes sprawled across hundreds of square kilometers. The 9th Legion's assault doctrine, emphasized close-quarters combat and vertical maneuver, tactics well-suited to fighting in the three-dimensional environment of industrial structures. Blood Angels assault squads used their jump packs to access upper levels of factory towers, attacking from unexpected directions and creating chaos among defending orcs. The Legion's emphasis on blade weapons proved effective in the confined spaces where ranged combat became difficult. The Blood Angels encountered some of the most intense resistance of the entire campaign. The orcs fought with particular ferocity to defend their industrial base, recognizing that its loss would cripple their ability to produce weapons and vehicles. Orc mobs poured from the factories in seemingly endless waves, their numbers constantly replenished from the massive populations that worked the forge complexes. Sanguinius led his legion with personal example, his presence on the battlefield inspiring the Blood Angels to extraordinary feats. The Primarch's ability to sense the flow of combat allowed him to identify critical moments and position his forces to maximum effect. The fighting in the industrial zones generated fierce competition among the legions for kill counts and battle honors. This rivalry, while sometimes creating friction, generally served to motivate individual warriors and units to greater efforts. Companies tracked their tallies of orcs slain, vehicles destroyed, and objectives secured. Legion champions challenged each other to duels and contests of martial skill during brief respites between engagements. The Emperor tolerated this competitive spirit, recognizing that it channeled the Legion's aggressive instincts in productive directions while fostering unit cohesion and pride. Mortarian's Death Guard operated in regions where the orcs had employed chemical and biological weapons extensively, creating contaminated zones that would have been lethal to unprotected humans. The 14th Legion's resistance to toxins and disease made them ideal for operations in these environments. Death Guard forces advanced through poisoned landscapes wearing their distinctive Mark III plate armor, its enhanced environmental sealing protecting them from even the most virulent orc bioweapons. The Legion's doctrine emphasized relentless forward pressure, grinding down enemy resistance through sustained assault that accepted casualties in exchange for steady territorial gains. The Death Guard's advance through the toxin marshes demonstrated their particular strengths. The region had been transformed into a nightmare landscape by orc industrial runoff and deliberate chemical warfare. Pools of corrosive waste dotted the terrain, toxic fumes hung in the air, and diseased vegetation grew in twisted forms. Orcs defending the region had adapted to the conditions, their hardy physiology allowing them to function in environments that would kill most other species. The Death Guard pushed forward through conditions that would have stopped other Imperial forces, their advance measured in meters per hour, but never halting. Fulgrim's Emperor's Children brought their perfectionist approach to the campaign, each operation planned and executed with meticulous attention to detail. The 3rd Legion's forces operated in the Western Territories, targeting orc command centers and strategic installations. Emperor's Children assaults featured precisely coordinated movements, with each squad and vehicle positioned to support the others through interlocking fields of fire and mutual support. The Legion's emphasis on martial excellence meant that their warriors trained constantly, even during the campaign, seeking to refine their skills and perfect their techniques. Angron's World Eaters pursued the most direct approach of any Legion present at Ullanor. The 12th Legion's doctrine had evolved toward increasingly brutal close-quarters combat, with many warriors having adopted the practice of implanting neural augmetics similar to those their Primarch bore. These implants enhanced aggression and pain tolerance, but at the cost of reducing tactical flexibility and impulse control. World Eaters' assaults featured mass charges into enemy positions, their warriors seeking close combat, where their enhanced ferocity provided maximum advantage. The World Eaters' assault on Orc position designation, Theta 7, showcased both the strengths and limitations of their approach. The position consisted of a fortified ridgeline held by multiple orc mobs supported by heavy weapons. World Eaters' companies advanced directly toward the orc lines under heavy fire, accepting casualties that would have caused other units to seek cover or maneuver for better positions. The 12th Legion warriors charged the final 100 meters at full sprint, their chain axes and chainswords raised. The assault crashed into the Orc lines, with devastating impact, World Eaters and Greenskins engaging in savage melee combat. The fighting devolved into a series of individual duels and small group combats as formations broke down in the chaos of close-quarters battle. World Eaters' warriors fought with berserker fury, their neural implants driving them to ever greater acts of violence. Orcs met them with equal savagery, the Greenskins' natural aggression matching the artificially enhanced ferocity of the 12th Legion. The battle continued for hours, neither side willing to yield ground. Eventually, World Eaters' numbers and superior equipment prevailed, the surviving Orcs either dying in place or being hunted down as they attempted to withdraw. The contrasts between Legion doctrines created both challenges and opportunities for inter-Legion cooperation. Operations that required multiple legions to coordinate their efforts sometimes encountered friction as different command philosophies clashed. Imperial Fist's officers planning methodical sieges found themselves frustrated by White Scar's requests for rapid redeployment of supporting assets. World Eaters companies assigned to support Emperor's Children operations sometimes launched premature assaults that disrupted carefully planned attack sequences. The Emperor and Horus spent considerable effort mediating these conflicts and ensuring that tactical disagreements did not escalate into serious breaches of cooperation. Notable engagements demonstrated what could be achieved when legions successfully coordinated their distinct capabilities. The assault on Orc stronghold designation, Omega Prime, involved forces from 4 different legions working in concert. White Scar's units conducted diversionary attacks that drew Orc attention away from the main assault axis. Imperial Fist's siege units established breaching positions and reduced the stronghold's outer defenses through sustained bombardment. Blood Angel's assault companies exploited the breach, their speed and close combat prowess overwhelming the defenders. Luna Wolf's tactical companies secured the captured positions and established defensive perimeters against Orc counterattacks. The camaraderie forged between warriors of different legions during shared combat operations created bonds that would persist long after the Ullanor Campaign concluded. Space Marines from different legions exchanged tactical knowledge and combat techniques, each learning from the other's experiences and approaches. Veterans who had fought alongside warriors from other legions developed mutual respect that transcended legion rivalry. These personal connections created informal networks of communication and cooperation that supplemented the formal command structure. The intelligence-gathering operations to locate Urlakk Urg's command fortress began weeks before the final assault, utilizing every resource available to the Imperial war machine. Legion scout units from multiple legions penetrated deep into Orc-held territory, operating independently behind enemy lines for extended periods. These reconnaissance teams moved through contested zones with extreme caution, avoiding detection while gathering information about Orc troop movements, supply routes, and command structures. White Scar scouts proved particularly effective at this work, their legion's emphasis on speed and mobility allowing them to cover vast distances and withdraw before Orc patrols could intercept them. The scouts employed a variety of methods to gather intelligence without revealing their presence. Augur arrays concealed in elevated positions monitored Orc communications traffic, primitive though it was. The Greenskins' Vox chatter provided valuable information about the locations of important warbosses and the movement of significant forces. Imperial scouts observed Orc supply convoys from concealed positions, tracking their routes to identify major logistics hubs and command centers. The patterns that emerged from weeks of observation began to paint a picture of the Orc Empire's structure and the location of its nerve center. Captured Orcs provided another critical source of intelligence, though extracting useful information from Greenskin prisoners presented unique challenges. Orcs possessed a fundamentally different psychology than humans or most other intelligent species. They felt no loyalty to abstract concepts like nation or ideology, only to strength and personal dominance. An Orc whose boss had been killed felt no obligation to maintain secrecy and would often boast about their former leader's power and holdings. Imperial interrogators learned to exploit this tendency, framing their questions in ways that encouraged orcs to brag about the might of their warbosses and the size of their territories. The interrogations took place in secure facilities behind Imperial lines, where captured orcs could be isolated and questioned without risk of escape. The Greenskins' physical toughness meant that conventional interrogation techniques proved ineffective. Pain that would break a human subject barely registered with an orc, whose biology allowed them to function through injuries that would incapacitate other species. Instead, interrogators focused on psychological approaches, challenging the orcs' assertions about their boss's power and goading them into providing details to prove their claims. One particularly valuable prisoner, a nob who had served in Urlakk Urg's personal guard before being captured during a failed counterattack, provided crucial information about the warboss's fortress. The nob boasted extensively about the fortress's size and defenses, describing walls that stretched for kilometers and weapon emplacements that could shoot down spacecraft. While the orcs' descriptions were colored by exaggeration and limited technical understanding, skilled interrogators extracted useful details about the fortress's layout, the size of its garrison, and the types of defenses it mounted. The accumulated intelligence indicated that Urlakk Urg's command fortress occupied a massive complex in the northern highlands of Ullanor Prime. The site had been chosen for its natural defensive advantages, situated on elevated terrain that dominated the surrounding landscape. Orc construction had transformed the location into a sprawling fortified zone that covered hundreds of square kilometers. The fortress complex consisted of multiple interconnected structures, each serving different functions within the orc war machine. Barracks housed thousands of orc warriors, armories stored weapons and ammunition in vast quantities, and command centers coordinated operations across the entire planet. The fortress's defenses exceeded anything the Imperium had encountered during the campaign. Massive walls constructed from layered armor plate and reinforced rockcrete surrounded the inner complex, their thickness measured in meters rather than centimeters. Weapon towers dotted the perimeter at regular intervals, each mounting multiple heavy guns capable of engaging ground and air targets. Anti-aircraft batteries covered the approaches from every direction, creating overlapping fields of fire that would exact a terrible toll on any aerial assault. Minefields and obstacle belts extended outward from the walls, channeling attackers into killing zones covered by pre-sighted artillery. The garrison consisted of the largest concentration of elite orc forces on the planet. Urlakk Urg had gathered his most powerful nobs to serve as his personal guard and command his fortress's defense. These were not ordinary orcs, but veterans of countless battles, each having proven themselves through combat and risen through the brutal hierarchy of Greenskin society. Many wore mega armor, crude but effective powered exoskeletons that enhanced their already formidable strength and provided protection against all but the heaviest weapons. The nobs commanded mobs of elite orc boys, warriors who had survived long enough to accumulate quality equipment and combat experience. The fortress also housed a significant concentration of orc war machines. Intelligence reports confirmed the presence of at least a dozen gargants within the complex, their massive forms visible on orbital reconnaissance images. These towering war machines served as both weapons platforms and symbols of Urlakk Urg's power. Hundreds of smaller vehicles filled motor pools and maintenance yards throughout the fortress, ready to deploy in support of the garrison or launch counterattacks against Imperial forces. The concentration of military power within the fortress represented a significant portion of the remaining orc strength on Ullanor Prime. The Emperor and his Primarchs reviewed the intelligence assessments during a strategic council held aboard the Bucephalus. The hololithic displays showed detailed maps of the fortress complex, compiled from multiple intelligence sources and rendered in 3 dimensions. The Primarchs studied the defenses with professional interest, each evaluating the fortress from their particular tactical perspective. Dorn analyzed the structural characteristics of the walls and identified potential weak points. Horus examined the deployment of the garrison forces and proposed approaches that would divide the defenders' attention. The Khan suggested rapid strikes against the anti-aircraft batteries to create corridors for aerial assault. The final assault plan incorporated elements from multiple proposals, creating a coordinated operation that would employ the full spectrum of Imperial capabilities. The attack would begin with orbital bombardment to suppress the fortress's anti-aircraft defenses and create breaches in the outer walls. Space Marine forces would then conduct simultaneous assaults at multiple points, preventing the defenders from concentrating their strength. Titan legions would engage the Gargants in direct combat, neutralizing the Orcs' most powerful weapons. Imperial army formations would establish blocking positions to prevent Orc reinforcements from reaching the fortress. The Emperor assigned Horus overall command of the assault, with authority to coordinate the actions of all participating forces. The bombardment commenced at dawn, the sky above the fortress lighting up as lance strikes from the orbiting fleet reached down through the atmosphere. Each lance beam carried enough energy to vaporize buildings and melt armor plate, their impacts creating massive explosions that shook the ground for kilometers around. The Orcs' anti-aircraft batteries returned fire, launching missiles and shells toward the Imperial fleet in orbit. Most of these projectiles failed to reach their targets, destroyed by point defense systems or burning up during atmospheric transit. Those that did reach orbit rarely penetrated the void shields protecting Imperial vessels. The bombardment continued for hours, systematically reducing the fortress's outer defenses. Weapon towers disappeared in expanding fireballs as lance strikes found their magazines. Sections of wall collapsed as sustained fire weakened their structural integrity. The Orcs responded with characteristic defiance, their remaining weapons maintaining fire even as the fortress crumbled around them. Orc crews served their guns until the weapons themselves were destroyed, showing the same savage determination that had characterized Greenskin resistance throughout the campaign. As the bombardment lifted, drop pods began their descent from orbit. Thousands of pods streaked through the atmosphere, their heat shields glowing red from friction. The pods came down across the entire fortress complex, each one containing a squad of Space Marines ready to fight the moment the hatches opened. Luna Wolves' forces landed in the northern sectors, their objective the fortress's primary command center. Imperial Fists pods came down near the breaches created by orbital bombardment, their squads tasked with securing entry points for follow-on forces. Blood Angels descended into the fortress's interior courtyards, their assault squads using jump packs to reach elevated positions. The fighting that erupted across the fortress complex exceeded even the intense combat that had characterized earlier stages of the campaign. The Orcs fought with desperate ferocity, recognizing that this battle would determine the fate of their entire empire. Knobs in mega armor led counter-attacks against Space Marine positions, their power claws capable of tearing through ceramite armor. Orc mobs charged from fortified positions, accepting horrific casualties to close with the Imperial forces. The confined spaces of the fortress's interior created brutal close-quarters battles, where the advantages of superior Imperial equipment and training were partially offset by the Orcs' numerical superiority and savage aggression. Horus led his Luna Wolves toward the central command complex, fighting through multiple defensive lines. The Primarch wielded Worldbreaker, his Thunder Hammer, the weapon's power field crackling with barely contained energy. Each swing of the massive hammer crushed Orcs and shattered their equipment, the impact creating shockwaves that knocked nearby Greenskins off their feet. Horus's command squad fought beside their Primarch, their bolters and power weapons clearing a path through the Orc defenders. The Luna Wolves advanced with methodical efficiency, each squad covering the others as they moved through corridors and chambers choked with enemies. The Gargants within the fortress activated and began moving toward the breaches in the outer walls, their massive forms towering over the surrounding structures. The War Machine's weapons opened fire at maximum rate, their cannons and missiles targeting concentrations of Imperial forces. Buildings collapsed under the impact of Gargant fire, their walls unable to withstand weapons designed to engage fortifications and super-heavy vehicles. The Mechanicum's Titan legions moved to engage these threats, god machines from Legio Mortis and Legio Ignatum striding through the breaches and taking up firing positions. The battles between Titans and Gargants shook the fortress to its foundations. Plasma weapons superheated the air, their discharge creating thunder that echoed across the battlefield. Gargant cannons hurled shells that could penetrate Titan armor, each hit testing the integrity of void shields and adamantium plate. The engagements occurred at ranges measured in hundreds of meters, close enough that the combatants could see the damage their weapons inflicted. Titans advanced while maintaining fire, their princeps coordinating with their Moderati crews to keep weapons tracking targets while maneuvering for advantageous positions. One warlord Titan from Legio Mortis, the Imperator Rex, engaged 3 Gargants simultaneously in the fortress's central plaza. The Titan's plasma destructor carved molten channels through the lead Gargant's armor, the superheated beam cutting deep into the war machine's internal structure. The Gargant's return fire hammered against the warlord's void shields, each impact causing the defensive field to flare with discharged energy. The Titan's princeps maintained steady advance, trusting in his shields, while his weapons crews worked to destroy the Gargants before they could coordinate their fire effectively. The second Gargant exploded as a plasma shot penetrated its reactor, the detonation catching the third Gargant in the blast and crippling it. Horus and his forces fought their way into the central command complex, a massive structure that rose above the surrounding fortress like a crude mountain. The building's interior consisted of vast chambers connected by corridors wide enough to accommodate Orc vehicles. Orc defenders filled these spaces, their numbers so great that they formed a solid mass of green flesh and crude armor. The Luna Wolves advanced through this nightmare with disciplined fire and coordinated assault, their bolters cutting down Orcs while assault squads cleared rooms with flamers and meltaguns. The confrontation between Horus and Urlakk Urg occurred in the fortress's throne room, a cavernous chamber at the structure's apex. The warboss occupied a massive throne constructed from welded armor plate and decorated with trophies from countless battles. Urlakk Urg stood as Horus entered, his size exceeding even that of other Orc warbosses. The Greenskin leader war armor that incorporated elements looted from defeated enemies, including sections of Space Marine plate and what appeared to be components from an Imperial Knight. He wielded a power claw of exceptional size and craftsmanship, its energy field strong enough to tear through vehicle armor. The warboss's elite bodyguard, a dozen knobs in mega armor, moved to intercept the Luna Wolves. Horus's command squad engaged these warriors, while the Primarch advanced directly toward Urlakk Urg. The throne room erupted into savage combat as Space Marines and Orcs clashed in brutal melee. The knobs fought with the accumulated experience of decades of warfare, their power claws and massive choppas capable of killing even Space Marines with single blows. The Luna Wolves met them with equal ferocity, their training and equipment allowing them to fight the larger Orcs on nearly equal terms. Horus and Urlakk Urg circled each other, the Primarch and the warboss each evaluating their opponent. The Orc spoke in his crude language, his words a mixture of boasts and challenges. Horus made no response, his focus absolute as he calculated angles of attack and defensive positions. Urlakk Urg charged with surprising speed for a being of his size, his power claw sweeping toward Horus's head. The Primarch sidestepped the attack and brought Worldbreaker around in a devastating arc that caught the Orc in the ribs. The Thunder Hammer's impact crushed armor and pulverized the flesh beneath, the power field's discharge sending electrical arcs across the warboss's body. The Orc staggered but remained standing, his incredible physiology allowing him to function despite injuries that would have killed most beings instantly. Urlakk Urg's counterattack came immediately, his power claw snapping closed where Horus had stood moments before. The Primarch moved with fluid grace, each motion economical and precise. Worldbreaker struck again, this time catching the Orc's arm and shattering the limb. The power claw fell away, its energy field flickering and dying as the weapon separated from its power source. Horus pressed his advantage, his attacks coming in rapid succession that gave the wounded warboss no opportunity to recover. Each strike of Worldbreaker inflicted catastrophic damage, breaking bones and rupturing organs. Urlakk Urg attempted to fight back with his remaining arm, his massive fist capable of crushing ceramite, but the Primarch avoided each blow with minimal movement. The final strike caught the warboss in the chest, the Thunder Hammer's impact creating a shockwave that could be felt throughout the throne room. Urlakk Urg's body collapsed, the warboss's incredible vitality finally overcome by the accumulated damage. The death of Urlakk Urg sent psychic shockwaves through the Orc forces across Ullanor Prime. The Greenskins' collective consciousness, the Wa field that had bound them together under their leader's will, collapsed instantly. Orcs throughout the fortress and across the planet suddenly found themselves without the psychic direction that had coordinated their efforts. The immediate effect was confusion and disorientation as individual orcs and small groups attempted to understand what had happened. Within minutes, this confusion transformed into violence as different orc factions began fighting among themselves. The orc command structure disintegrated as subordinate warbosses immediately began competing for dominance. Without Urlakk Urg's overwhelming presence to enforce unity, the Greenskin hierarchy reverted to its natural state of constant competition and conflict. Orc mobs that had been fighting Imperial forces moments before turned on each other, disputes over leadership and territory erupting into savage battles. The fortress descended into chaos as different orc factions claimed various sections and began fortifying them against their rivals. Imperial forces exploited this collapse with ruthless efficiency. Space Marine companies that had been engaged in grinding combat suddenly found their opponents distracted and disorganized. Luna Wolves squads advanced through sections of the fortress that had been heavily defended minutes earlier, encountering only scattered resistance from Orcs too focused on fighting each other to mount coordinated defense. The Imperial fists consolidated their hold on the breaches and began systematically clearing the outer defensive zones. Blood Angels assault squads swept through the fortress's upper levels, eliminating isolated orc groups that had barricaded themselves in defensive positions. The fighting continued for hours as Imperial forces methodically cleared the fortress complex, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The orcs' numerical advantage meant nothing when they spent as much effort fighting each other as defending against the Imperial assault. Entire sections of the fortress fell without significant resistance as orc defenders abandoned their positions to join the infighting. By nightfall, Imperial forces controlled the majority of the complex, with only isolated pockets of orc resistance remaining in the deepest bunkers and most heavily fortified positions. Similar patterns played out across Ullanor Prime as news of Urlakk Urg's death spread through the remaining orc forces. Greenskin armies that had been conducting coordinated defensive operations dissolved into competing warbands. Supply networks collapsed as orcs abandoned logistics duties to join the fighting for dominance. The massive industrial complexes that had been producing weapons and vehicles ground to a halt as their orc workers either fled or began fighting over control of the facilities. The empire that Urlakk Urg had built through force of will and brutal efficiency came apart in days, undone by the fundamental nature of orc psychology that made sustained unity impossible without overwhelming leadership. The pacification of Ullanor Prime continued for weeks after Urlakk Urg's death, though the character of the fighting changed dramatically. Imperial forces no longer faced a unified enemy, but rather countless smaller orc factions competing for dominance while simultaneously resisting human encroachment. This fragmentation simplified the military situation in some respects while complicating it in others. The orcs no longer coordinated their defensive efforts or concentrated their forces effectively, allowing Imperial units to defeat them in detail. However, the sheer number of separate orc groups meant that clearing operations required methodical sweeps through every sector of the planet, rooting out greenskin concentrations from industrial complexes, underground bunker systems, and remote wilderness regions. The Imperial Army bore the primary responsibility for these clearing operations. Space Marine forces had achieved their primary objective with the destruction of Urlakk Urg's command structure, and the Emperor began withdrawing Legion elements for redeployment to other theaters. The Legions left behind garrison companies to support ongoing operations, but the bulk of their strength departed Ullanor within a month of the fortress's fall. The Imperial Army regiments that remained faced a grinding campaign against an enemy that refused to surrender and could not be reasoned with. Orc biology meant that even after the death of every adult greenskin, spores would continue producing new generations unless the contaminated soil was thoroughly sterilized. The Mechanicum deployed specialized equipment to address the spore contamination problem. Tech priests brought incinerator units that could raise temperatures high enough to destroy orc spores buried meters beneath the surface. Chemical treatment facilities processed vast quantities of compounds designed to render soil inhospitable to orcoid life forms. The scale of the decontamination effort exceeded anything previously attempted during the Great Crusade. Entire continents required treatment, a process that would take years to complete even with the resources the Mechanicum committed to the task. The Adeptus Mechanicus viewed the project as an opportunity to test theories about orc biology and develop more efficient methods for eliminating greenskin infestations on conquered worlds. The surrounding star systems of the Ullanor sector presented similar challenges. Orc forces throughout the region had fragmented following news of their leader's death, but substantial greenskin populations remained on dozens of worlds. Imperial expeditionary fleets conducted compliance operations across these systems, their campaigns following patterns established during the assault on Ullanor Prime. Naval forces established orbital superiority, ground forces secured landing zones and major population centers, and follow-on units began the long process of hunting down scattered orc groups. Some worlds fell quickly when their orc populations descended into infighting. Others required months of sustained operations to bring under Imperial control. The administrative burden of managing newly conquered territories strained Imperial bureaucratic systems. Each world required a governance structure capable of maintaining order and extracting the tithes that would support the Imperium's continued expansion. The populations on many of these worlds consisted primarily of human slaves who had labored under orc domination, their societies shattered by years or decades of brutal exploitation. Imperial administrators worked to establish basic services, restore infrastructure, and organize these traumatized populations into functional communities. The Adeptus Munitorum assigned officials with experience in post-compliance operations, but the sheer number of worlds requiring attention exceeded available personnel. The Emperor's decision to hold a triumph ceremony on Ullanor rather than Terra surprised many observers. Traditional practice called for celebrating major victories at the Imperial Palace, where the entire apparatus of Imperial government could participate and the populations of Terra could witness the fruits of the Great Crusade. The choice to instead transform the conquered orc capital into a stage for imperial pageantry carried profound symbolic significance. It demonstrated that the Imperium's power extended across the galaxy, that humanity could impose its will and culture even on worlds that had been strongholds of Xeno civilization. The message was clear to both Imperial citizens and potential enemies. Nowhere lay beyond the Emperor's reach, no enemy too strong to be defeated and subjugated. The practical challenges of organizing a triumph on Ullanor dwarfed those of similar ceremonies held on Terra. The planet's infrastructure had been designed by and for orcs, its crude facilities unsuitable for the elaborate displays the Emperor envisioned. Imperial engineers and Mechanicum construction teams spent weeks preparing the site, clearing rubble from Urlakk Urg's fortress complex, and erecting temporary structures to house the thousands of participants and observers. The central plaza where Horus had slain the orc warboss became the focal point for the ceremony, its blood-stained stones cleaned and covered with imported marble. Viewing stands rose on either side of a processional route that stretched for kilometers, their construction incorporating both imperial architectural elements and captured orc materials as a reminder of the enemy's defeat. The logistics of transporting over 100,000 Space Marines to Ullanor for the ceremony tested the Imperial Navy's capabilities. Legion elements scattered across multiple star systems required coordination to ensure their arrival at the designated time. Fleet assets already strained by ongoing combat operations throughout the sector had to be diverted to transport duties. Naval logistics officers calculated fuel requirements, transit times, and berthing assignments for thousands of vessels. The Adeptus Munitorum processed movement orders and supply requisitions on a scale that rivaled the initial invasion's complexity. Every legion committed substantial forces to attend the triumph, recognizing the political importance of the event even as their absence from other war zones created operational gaps. Imperial Army participation exceeded even the Space Marine contingent in raw numbers. Millions of soldiers from hundreds of regiments received orders to attend the ceremony, their presence demonstrating the Imperium's conventional military might. The regiments that had fought in the Ullanor Campaign received priority placement in the Triumph's Order of March, their battle honors earning them positions of prominence. Tank companies that had destroyed Orc armored formations would parade their vehicles through the processional route. Artillery batteries that had reduced fortress complexes would display their guns. Infantry regiments that had held critical positions against overwhelming Orc assaults would march in formation, their regimental colors flying, and their ranks filled with veterans bearing visible scars from the campaign. The diversity of Imperial Army forces reflected the Imperium's vast reach and the varied worlds that contributed to its military strength. Regiments from Hive worlds marched alongside units recruited from feudal societies. Soldiers whose equipment and training met the highest standards shared the parade route with formations whose war gear appeared crude by comparison, but whose courage and determination had proven equal to any challenge. This deliberate mixing of forces from across the Imperium served a propaganda purpose, demonstrating that humanity's strength came not from any single world or culture, but from the unity of countless populations working toward common goals. Representatives from the Adeptus Mechanicus arrived with their most impressive war machines. Titan legions that had participated in the campaign prepared their god machines for display, the towering constructs dominating the landscape and serving as visible proof of the Omnissiah's power. Tech priests performed elaborate blessing ceremonies on each Titan, their rituals ensuring that the machine spirits remained calm and cooperative during the proceedings. Skitarii cohorts in their distinctive red robes and augmetic enhancements formed precise ranks, their discipline and coordination reflecting the Mechanicum's emphasis on efficiency and function. Magos representatives from multiple Forge worlds attended, their presence acknowledging the critical role Mars and its allied facilities had played in supplying the campaign. The Remembrancers descended on Ullanor in unprecedented numbers, recognizing that the Triumph would provide material for works that would define how future generations understood the Great Crusade. Artists set up their equipment in advantageous positions, calculating angles and lighting that would produce the most dramatic images. Writers interviewed participants, collecting first-hand accounts of battles and personal experiences that would inform their narratives. Imagists prepared to capture every moment of the ceremony, their recordings destined for distribution throughout the Imperium. The Remembrancers operated under guidelines established by Imperial authorities, their work subject to review to ensure it conveyed approved messages, but within those constraints, they enjoyed considerable creative freedom. The preparation period allowed for informal interactions between forces that had operated in different sectors during the campaign. Space Marines from different legions exchanged accounts of their battles, comparing experiences and debating tactical approaches. Imperial Army officers from diverse regiments discovered common ground despite their varied backgrounds, their shared service in the Ullanor Campaign creating bonds that transcended planetary or cultural origins. These interactions served purposes beyond mere socializing. They built networks of personal relationships that would facilitate cooperation in future campaigns and strengthen the sense of common identity that the Emperor sought to cultivate among Imperial military forces. The ceremonies staging incorporated elements designed to emphasize specific themes and messages. The processional route began at the site of the initial Imperial landing zones and proceeded through territories that had seen heavy fighting, passing destroyed Orc fortifications and industrial complexes. This path reminded observers of the campaign's cost and the enemy's former strength, making the victory appear more impressive by contrast. The route terminated at Urlakk Urg's former throne room, where the Emperor would address the assembled forces from the same location where Horus had slain the Orc warboss. This choice of venue carried obvious symbolic weight, the Master of Mankind standing where the greatest Orc leader had ruled, demonstrating the complete reversal of fortunes. The scale of the gathering created security challenges that required careful planning. Concentrating so many high-value targets in a single location presented opportunities for enemies who might attempt assassination or sabotage. The Legio Custodes deployed in strength, their golden armor visible throughout the ceremony site as they maintained vigilant watch. Space Marine companies from multiple legions rotated through security assignments, their enhanced senses and combat capabilities making them ideal for detecting and neutralizing threats. Imperial Army security battalions established perimeter defenses and controlled access to the ceremony grounds. Naval assets maintained orbital overwatch, their auger arrays scanning for any sign of approaching threats. The days leading up to the ceremony saw increasing activity as final preparations reached completion. Regiments conducted rehearsals of their march sequences, ensuring that their movements would proceed smoothly during the actual event. Legion companies verified their equipment and made final adjustments to their armor and weapons, understanding that their appearance would be documented and distributed throughout the Imperium. Tech priests performed last-minute maintenance on vehicles and war machines, their rituals ensuring that no mechanical failures would mar the proceedings. The atmosphere combined anticipation with underlying tension, the awareness that this gathering represented a pivotal moment in the Great Crusade's history. The Triumph would serve multiple audiences simultaneously. For the Space Marines and Imperial Army soldiers who had fought in the campaign, it provided recognition of their sacrifices and achievements, reinforcing their commitment to the Imperium's cause. For the broader Imperial military establishment, it demonstrated what could be accomplished through proper coordination and overwhelming force, setting standards for future operations. For newly compliant worlds throughout the galaxy, the images and accounts from Ullanor would illustrate the futility of resistance and the benefits of cooperation. For potential enemies, it sent an unmistakable message about the consequences of opposing humanity's expansion. The transformation of Urlakk Urg's capital from the heart of a Xenos empire to a stage for imperial celebration represented a fundamental assertion about humanity's place in the galaxy. The Orcs had built their civilization through conquest and exploitation, creating an empire that threatened to overwhelm human space through sheer numbers and savage aggression. The Imperium had not merely defeated this threat, but had occupied the enemy's heartland and remade it according to human preferences. The speed of this transformation, from active war zone to ceremonial ground in a matter of weeks, demonstrated organizational capabilities that few other civilizations could match. The gathering also provided opportunities for political maneuvering and relationship building among the Imperium's leadership. Primarchs who had operated in different sectors during the campaign could meet face to face, discussing their experiences and coordinating future operations. Imperial Army commanders established connections with their counterparts from other regions, creating networks that would facilitate cooperation when their forces operated together in subsequent campaigns. Mechanicum representatives negotiated agreements about resource allocation and technological support with military leaders whose forces they would supply. These informal negotiations often proved as important as the formal ceremony itself, shaping the Imperium's military structure in ways that would persist for decades. The scale and expense of the Triumph generated some criticism from officials who questioned the allocation of resources to what they viewed as unnecessary pageantry. Transport vessels used to move troops to Ullanor could have been employed hauling supplies to active war zones. The personnel committed to organizing and securing the ceremony represented a substantial diversion of effort from productive military operations. The counterargument, which the Emperor's representatives articulated clearly, emphasized the propaganda value and morale benefits that justified the expenditure. A successful triumph would inspire loyalty and determination throughout the imperial military, while demonstrating to conquered populations that the Imperium possessed not just military might, but also the cultural sophistication to organize elaborate ceremonies. The ceremony would also mark a transition point in the Great Crusade's strategic direction. The Ullanor Campaign had required concentrating resources on a scale that could not be sustained indefinitely. The Emperor's personal involvement had diverted his attention from other critical projects, particularly the mysterious work beneath the Imperial Palace that consumed increasing amounts of his time. The Triumph would celebrate not just the victory over the Orcs, but also the successful conclusion of a phase in the Crusade's development. Following Ullanor, the Emperor would delegate greater authority to his Primarchs, trusting them to prosecute campaigns with less direct oversight while he focused on other priorities that he deemed equally important to humanity's future. The Triumph ceremony commenced under a sky cleared of orbital debris, Imperial fleet elements having swept the space above Ullanor prime clean of the wrecked hulks and drifting wreckage that had cluttered the void since the campaign's naval battles. The processional began at dawn, the timing calculated to provide optimal lighting for the Remembrancers' documentation efforts. The first formations to march were the Imperial Army regiments that had secured the initial landing zones, their battle-worn banners and scarred armor serving as testament to the campaign's brutal opening phases. These soldiers moved in precise formation despite weeks of continuous combat operations, their discipline holding firm even after the exhaustion of extended campaigning. The Luna Wolves marched in position of honor near the procession's head, their gray armor polished to mirror brightness for the occasion. The 16th Legion's warriors carried their bolters at ceremonial present, the weapons mechanisms locked open to demonstrate they posed no threat during the peaceful gathering. Veterans who had fought through Urlakk Urg's fortress complex bore additional honors on their armor, campaign badges and purity seals that marked their participation in the decisive engagements. Horus walked at the formation's front, his presence drawing attention from observers lining the processional route. The Primarch wore armor that combined functional war plate with ceremonial ornamentation, the balance reflecting his understanding that this event served both military and political purposes. The other legions followed in sequence, each marching under their distinctive colors and carrying their particular traditions. The Imperial fists advanced with the geometric precision that characterized all their activities, their yellow armor creating a solid block of color that stretched for hundreds of meters. The white scars moved with barely contained energy, their warriors maintaining formation discipline while radiating an eagerness to return to active operations. The Blood Angels drew particular attention from observers, their red armor and noble bearing creating an impression of warrior aristocrats rather than simple soldiers. Each legion's passage generated distinctive reactions from the crowds, the observers recognizing the different combat doctrines and reputations that each formation had built during the Great Crusade. The Mechanicum's contribution to the procession demonstrated the Forge World's industrial and military might. Skitarii cohorts marched in perfect synchronization, their augmented bodies moving with mechanical precision. The tech priests accompanying these formations chanted Binharic cant, their vocalizations creating an otherworldly harmony that blended human voices with electronic tones. The Titans came last among the Mechanicum forces, their massive forms dominating the processional route. Each god machine had been decorated with victory banners and honor scrolls, the parchments listing the Gargants and Orc strongpoints each Titan had destroyed during the campaign. The ground shook with each step the Titans took, the vibrations serving as physical reminders of the devastating power these war machines could bring to bear. The Imperial Army formations that followed represented dozens of different worlds and military traditions. Cadian pattern regiments marched alongside units equipped with locally produced weapons and armor that bore little resemblance to standard Imperial issue. Veterans from Hive World gangs who had been pressed into service walked the same route as professional soldiers from civilized worlds, where military service represented an honored tradition. This diversity illustrated the Imperium's inclusive approach to military recruitment, accepting contributions from any human population willing to fight for humanity's unified future. The varying quality of equipment and training among these units created some visual inconsistency, but their shared participation in the Ullanor victory provided common ground that transcended their differences. The processional route's design ensured that marching formations passed sites of significant battles and captured Orc installations. Destroyed bunker complexes served as backdrops for portions of the march, their shattered walls and burned-out weapon emplacements providing visual evidence of the fighting's intensity. Captured Orc vehicles and weapons had been arranged in displays along the route, their crude construction contrasting sharply with Imperial equipment's sophistication. These arrangements served educational purposes, allowing observers unfamiliar with Orc technology to understand the nature of the enemy the Imperium had defeated. The displays also emphasized the technological superiority that gave Imperial forces advantages over numerically superior foes. The Emperor observed the procession from a reviewing stand constructed at the route's midpoint, his position allowing him to watch each formation as it passed. The Primarchs who were not marching with their legions stood with their father, their presence creating an assembly of the Imperium's greatest military leaders. The interactions between the Emperor and his sons during the procession revealed the relationships that had developed during the campaign. The Emperor spoke briefly with each Primarch as their legion passed, his comments acknowledging specific achievements and contributions. These exchanges, though short, carried weight that extended beyond their immediate content. A word of praise from the Master of Mankind could influence a Primarch standing among his brothers and shape his future assignments. The procession continued for hours, the sheer number of participants requiring extended time to pass through the ceremonial route. Observers in the viewing stands witnessed a display of military power that few civilizations could match, the assembled forces representing only a fraction of the Imperium's total strength, but still numbering in the millions. The psychological impact of this display served multiple purposes. For Imperial military personnel, it reinforced pride in their service and confidence in the Imperium's ultimate victory. For representatives from newly compliant worlds, it demonstrated the futility of resistance and the benefits of cooperation. The Remembrancers documented every aspect, their recordings and written accounts destined for distribution throughout Imperial space. The ceremony's climax occurred when the procession reached Urlakk Urg's former throne room, now transformed into an assembly ground capable of holding tens of thousands of observers. The Emperor ascended to a platform constructed where the Orc warboss's throne had stood, the symbolism obvious to all present. The Master of Mankind's physical presence dominated the space despite the vast chamber's size, his stature and bearing commanding attention without requiring overt displays of power. The assembled Space Marines, Imperial Army soldiers, and Mechanicum representatives filled the chamber to capacity, their numbers creating a sea of varied armor colors and unit insignia that stretched to the limits of visibility. The Emperor's address began with acknowledgement of the campaign's cost. Casualty figures for the Ullanor Campaign exceeded those of most previous Great Crusade operations, the fighting's intensity and the enemy's determination resulting in losses that would require years to replace. The Emperor spoke of these sacrifices without minimizing their significance, his words recognizing that victory had been purchased with blood and that the fallen deserved remembrance. This acknowledgement served important morale purposes, demonstrating that the Imperium's leadership understood and valued the contributions of individual soldiers rather than viewing them as expendable resources. The families of fallen warriors throughout the Imperium would receive word that the Emperor himself had honored their loved ones' sacrifices. The transition to discussing the campaign's strategic significance came naturally, the Emperor's words shifting from commemoration to analysis. The destruction of Urlakk Urg's empire had eliminated the most significant Orc threat humanity had faced since the Age of Strife. The Greenskin population throughout the Ullanor sector and surrounding regions had been reduced to manageable levels, their ability to threaten Imperial space effectively neutralized. The campaign had also demonstrated the Imperium's capability to concentrate overwhelming force when necessary, projecting power across vast distances and sustaining complex operations for extended periods. These achievements would resonate throughout the galaxy, influencing the calculations of other Xeno civilizations and human polities that might consider resisting Imperial expansion. The Emperor's announcement of his intention to return to Terra came without extensive preamble. The Master of Mankind stated simply that his presence was required for work on Terra that could not be delayed further. The mysterious project beneath the Imperial Palace demanded his personal attention, its importance to humanity's future exceeding even the Great Crusade's significance. This declaration surprised no one who had followed the emperor's increasing focus on matters beyond direct military command. His withdrawal from active campaign leadership had been gradual but consistent, with more authority delegated to the Primarchs with each passing year. The Ullanor Campaign had represented an exception to this pattern, the threat's magnitude justifying his personal involvement, but the victory's completion allowed return to the previous trajectory. The necessity of appointing a supreme military commander to coordinate the Great Crusade in the Emperor's absence followed logically from this announcement. The Imperium's expansion had reached a scale where dozens of simultaneous campaigns occurred across multiple segmentums. Individual Primarchs commanded their legions with authority over assigned operational zones, but no unified strategic direction existed beyond the Emperor's own oversight. The creation of a position with authority to coordinate these disparate efforts and make strategic decisions that affected the entire crusade represented a significant evolution in Imperial command structure. The Emperor had considered this step for some time, the Ullanor Campaign providing both the justification and the opportunity to implement it. The title Warmaster carried historical resonance, evoking memories of ancient Terran military traditions while creating something new for the Imperium's particular circumstances. The position would hold authority over all Imperial military forces in the Emperor's absence, including the Space Marine legions, Imperial Army formations, and Mechanicum assets deployed in support of the Great Crusade. This authority extended to strategic planning, resource allocation, and the assignment of forces to specific campaigns. The Warmaster would coordinate with the Council of Terra on matters of supply and reinforcement, but would possess final authority over military operations. The scope of power invested in this position exceeded anything previously granted to any individual besides the Emperor himself. The Emperor's selection of Horus Lupercal for this role surprised no one familiar with the Primarch's records and capabilities. Horus had compiled the most impressive campaign record of any Primarch, his victories numbering in the hundreds, and his success rate exceeding even the most optimistic projections. His ability to coordinate complex multi-force operations had been demonstrated repeatedly during the Ullanor Campaign, where he had effectively commanded not just his own legion, but also substantial Imperial Army and Mechanicum forces. His relationships with his brother Primarchs were generally positive, with even those whose temperaments differed significantly from his own acknowledging his capabilities and achievements. The Emperor's choice validated what many observers had suspected for years, that Horus represented the first among equals in the Brotherhood of Primarchs. The formal investiture ceremony incorporated elements designed to emphasize the significance of the moment. The Emperor presented Horus with symbols of his new authority, physical objects that represented the powers and responsibilities being transferred. A master-crafted power sword replaced Horus's existing blade, the weapon's construction incorporating technologies that made it superior to standard Primarch armament. The sword's hilt bore inscriptions in ancient Terran languages, their meaning lost to all but the most learned scholars, but their presence connecting the moment to humanity's deep past. The blade itself had been forged on Terra using techniques that dated to the age of technology, its edge capable of cutting through virtually any material, and its power field generator producing effects that exceeded conventional weapon systems. The second symbol took the form of a medallion bearing the Imperial Aquila, the two-headed eagle that served as the Imperium's primary symbol. The medallion's size and weight gave it presence, the gold and precious metals used in its construction marking it as an object of significance rather than mere decoration. The Emperor placed this medallion around Horus's neck personally, the gesture carrying weight beyond the physical transfer of the object. The medallion represented the authority Horus would wield in the Emperor's name, serving as visible proof of his position when dealing with Imperial officials and military commanders throughout the galaxy. Any who saw this medallion would know they faced not just a Primarch, but the Emperor's chosen representative with authority to command in his absence. The assembled Primarchs witnessed their brother's elevation, with reactions that ranged from wholehearted support to more complex emotions. Sanguinius stepped forward immediately to offer his congratulations, the angel's endorsement carrying particular weight given his own reputation and the respect he commanded among his brothers. The Blood Angels Primarch had worked closely with Horus throughout the Great Crusade, their forces coordinating on numerous campaigns, and his support reflected genuine friendship as well as professional respect. Sanguinius's words emphasized Horus's qualifications and expressed confidence that the newly elevated Warmaster would lead the Great Crusade to ultimate victory. Rogal Dorn's response demonstrated his characteristic directness. The Imperial Fist's Primarch acknowledged Horus's achievements and pledged the 7th Legion's support for the Warmaster's strategic direction. Dorn's words carried no flowery language or excessive praise, simply stating facts and commitments in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. This straightforward approach reflected Dorn's personality and his relationship with Horus, which combined professional respect with a certain emotional distance. The two Primarchs had worked together effectively during the Ullanor Campaign, their different approaches complementing each other, and Dorn saw no reason why this cooperation could not continue under the new command structure. Other Primarchs' reactions revealed more complicated feelings about the elevation. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors offered congratulations that observers noted lacked the warmth present in other Primarchs' responses. The 4th Legion's master had long harbored resentments about what he perceived as insufficient recognition for his contributions to the Great Crusade. The Iron Warriors had prosecuted some of the most difficult campaigns, reducing fortified positions and conducting grinding sieges that other legions avoided, yet their achievements received less celebration than the more dramatic victories won by forces like the Luna Wolves. Perturabo's feelings about Horus's elevation mixed genuine respect for his brother's abilities with bitterness about his own perceived lack of advancement. Mortarian's response similarly reflected complex emotions beneath a surface of formal propriety. The Death Guard's Primarch had built his legion into a force specialized in the most unpleasant forms of warfare, fighting in environments and conditions that would break other units. Mortarian took pride in his warriors' toughness and endurance, viewing these qualities as more valuable than the glory-seeking behavior he associated with some other legions. His congratulations to Horus carried undertones of skepticism about whether the new Warmaster truly understood the grinding, unglamorous work that constituted much of the Great Crusade's actual progress. Mortarian's relationship with Horus had always been cordial rather than close, the two Primarchs' personalities and approaches differing too greatly for deep friendship to develop. The Lion's reaction demonstrated his characteristic reserve. The Dark Angel's Primarch acknowledged Horus's elevation with words that committed his legion's support while revealing little of his personal feelings about the appointment. The Lion had competed with Horus on several occasions during the Great Crusade, their rivalry generally friendly, but marked by genuine competitiveness about who could achieve the most impressive victories. The Lion's campaign record rivaled Horus's in many respects, and some observers had speculated that he might have been considered for the Warmaster position. His response to Horus's elevation maintained dignity while avoiding excessive enthusiasm, a careful balance that reflected both his pride and his discipline. The ceremony's conclusion marked not just the end of a celebration, but the beginning of a new phase in the Great Crusade's prosecution. Horus now bore responsibility for coordinating military operations across the entire galaxy, a task that would require him to think beyond individual campaigns and consider the Imperium's strategic position in its totality. The Emperor's withdrawal to Terra meant that decisions previously requiring his direct input would now fall to the Warmaster, who would need to balance competing demands for resources and make choices that would affect billions of lives. The weight of this responsibility was evident in Horus's demeanor as the ceremony concluded, the Primarch's expression reflecting awareness of the burden he had accepted. The practical implications of the command structure change would become apparent in the weeks and months following the Triumph. Primarchs would now report to Horus rather than directly to the Emperor for matters of campaign coordination and strategic planning. Resource allocation decisions that had previously required approval from Terra would be made by the Warmaster's staff. The Council of Terra would coordinate with Horus's headquarters on matters affecting the Great Crusade's logistical support. These changes represented a fundamental shift in how the Imperium prosecuted its expansion, centralizing military authority in ways that would test the new system's effectiveness and reveal any weaknesses in its design. The Emperor's announcement of his withdrawal from the Great Crusade came during a private council held aboard the Bucephalus 3 days after the Triumph ceremony. The Primarchs gathered in the Strategium, expecting a planning session to discuss the allocation of forces for upcoming campaigns across the galaxy. Instead, the Master of Mankind informed his sons that he would be returning to Terra to focus on projects that could no longer be delayed. The work beneath the Imperial Palace had reached a critical phase, requiring his direct and sustained attention. The nature of this work remained vague in his explanation, references to humanity's future and the necessity of securing mankind's place in the galaxy, without elaboration on specific objectives or methods. The Primarchs received this news with varying degrees of understanding and concern. Horus, newly elevated to Warmaster, had been briefed more extensively than his brothers about the Emperor's intentions, though even he lacked complete information about the project's details. The Emperor spoke of psychic engineering on a scale never before attempted, of creating pathways through dimensions that would revolutionize human civilization and free humanity from dependencies that currently limited its potential. These explanations raised more questions than they answered, but the Emperor made clear that fuller disclosure would come at a later time when the work had progressed further. For now, his sons needed to trust that this project served humanity's ultimate interests as surely as their military conquests did. The lack of detailed explanation created an immediate sense of unease among several Primarchs. Mortarion, whose distrust of psychic phenomena ran deep due to his experiences on Barbarus, questioned the wisdom of pursuing projects that relied heavily on warp-based technologies. His concerns went unaddressed in any substantive way, the Emperor simply reiterating that the work was necessary and that he possessed understanding of these matters that his sons could not yet share. Perturabo sought clarification about the project's timeline and what benchmarks would indicate its completion, practical questions that reflected his engineering mindset. The Emperor provided no concrete answers, stating only that the work would take as long as necessary and that its importance exceeded any predetermined schedule. The Emperor's confidence in his son's ability to complete the Great Crusade without his direct oversight came through clearly in his words. He had spent 2 centuries building the legions Astartes into the most effective military force humanity had ever fielded. He had found and trained his Primarchs, each one a military genius in their own right. The appointment of Horus as Warmaster provided unified command that would coordinate their efforts and ensure strategic coherence. The infrastructure to support continued expansion existed throughout the Imperium, with forge worlds producing equipment, training facilities preparing new recruits, and administrative systems managing the integration of conquered territories. The Emperor expressed complete faith that his sons could finish what he had started, bringing the remaining human worlds into compliance and eliminating Xeno's threats that stood in the way of humanity's dominance. This expression of confidence, while intended to inspire and reassure, carried undertones that some Primarchs found troubling. The implication that the military phase of the Great Crusade represented work that could be delegated, while the Emperor focused on more important matters, suggested a hierarchy of significance that placed their achievements in a subordinate position. The Primarchs had spent decades conquering worlds, leading their legions through countless battles, and building the Imperium through force of arms. To be told that this work, while valuable, was not important enough to retain the Emperor's personal attention created questions about their own value and purpose within his broader plans. The Emperor's departure from the assembled fleet occurred within a week of the announcement. His flagship, accompanied by a substantial escort of custodian guard vessels and a detachment of the Imperial Fists assigned to strengthen Terra's defenses, translated into the warp for the journey back to the Sol system. The speed of this departure left little time for extended farewells or additional discussions about the implications of the command structure change. The Emperor met briefly with each Primarch individually before leaving, these private conversations varying in length and content depending on each son's relationship with their father and their role in the coming campaigns. The meeting between the Emperor and Horus lasted longest, the two discussing not just immediate operational concerns, but broader strategic questions about the Great Crusade's direction. The Emperor provided Horus with access to intelligence assessments and strategic planning documents that had previously been restricted to the highest levels of Imperial command. He outlined regions of the galaxy that required particular attention, threats that intelligence services had identified but not yet addressed, and political considerations that would affect how certain campaigns should be prosecuted. The Emperor emphasized that Horus now bore responsibility not just for military victory, but for the political and administrative dimensions of expansion, ensuring that conquered worlds integrated smoothly into the Imperium rather than becoming sources of future instability. The Emperor's instructions to the other Primarchs focused on their specific areas of expertise and the campaigns they would lead. Rogal Dorn received assignment to return to Terra after completing current operations. His skills in fortification needed to strengthen the Imperial Palace's defenses and oversee construction projects related to the mysterious work the Emperor was undertaking. The nature of these construction projects remained vague, references to deep excavations, and the creation of structures that would serve purposes Dorn would learn about in time. The Imperial Fists Primarch accepted these orders without question, his loyalty to the Emperor absolute and his trust in his father's judgment unwavering. Jagatai Khan received direction to continue operations in the Galactic East, where his legion's mobility and speed made them ideal for campaigns against scattered Xenos holdouts and human civilizations that had regressed during Old Night. The Emperor emphasized the importance of bringing these isolated human populations back into the Imperial fold, their genetic material and cultural knowledge valuable resources that should be preserved where possible. The Khan's approach to compliance, which often emphasized negotiation and cultural integration over pure military conquest, aligned well with these objectives. The Emperor expressed confidence that the White Scars would excel in this role, their Primarch's diplomatic skills complementing his martial abilities. The conversations with Primarchs whose relationships with the Emperor were more complicated carried different tones. The Emperor's meeting with Angron was brief, acknowledging the World Eater's effectiveness in combat while expressing concern about reports of increasing brutality and discipline problems within the 12th Legion. The Emperor stopped short of issuing direct criticism or orders to modify the Legion's practices, instead suggesting that Angron consider how the World Eater's reputation might affect their ability to achieve compliance through means other than pure violence. Angron's response was non-committal, the Primarch's resentment about his treatment during his initial discovery, and the Emperor's refusal to save his gladiator companions on Nuceria, creating barriers to open communication. The Emperor's departure left a void in the command structure that went beyond mere absence of authority. His presence had served as a unifying force that kept the Primarchs focused on common objectives despite their different personalities and approaches. The Master of Mankind possessed an ability to inspire loyalty and dedication that transcended rational calculation, his charisma and evident power creating bonds of devotion that held the Imperium together during its formative years. Without his physical presence to reinforce these bonds, the relationships between Primarchs would need to sustain themselves through mutual respect and shared commitment to the Great Crusade's goals. The practical challenges of continuing the Great Crusade without the Emperor's direct oversight became apparent immediately. Horus assumed his role as Warmaster with characteristic competence, establishing a command staff and communications network that allowed him to coordinate operations across vast distances. However, the authority he wielded, while extensive, lacked the absolute nature of the Emperor's commands. When the Emperor issued orders, they carried weight that made questioning or delay unthinkable. Horus's directives, while backed by his position and the Emperor's mandate, remained subject to interpretation and debate by Primarchs who viewed themselves as his equals in all but formal rank. The first major strategic decision Horus faced as Warmaster involved the allocation of Legion forces to different campaign theaters. Multiple regions of the galaxy required attention, from the pacification of remaining Orc territories in the Ullanor sector to campaigns against Xeno's empires in the galactic south and east. The Primarchs had their own preferences about where their legions should operate, preferences shaped by their tactical doctrines, their desire for glory and recognition, and their assessment of where they could make the most significant contributions. Horus needed to balance these preferences against strategic necessity, assigning forces where they were most needed rather than where they most wanted to serve. The resolution of this allocation process satisfied no one completely, but achieved workable compromises that kept the Great Crusade moving forward. Some Primarchs received assignments that aligned closely with their preferences, while others found themselves directed toward campaigns they considered less prestigious or interesting. The World Eaters and Death Guard received assignments to grinding compliance actions against stubborn human holdouts, campaigns that would require sustained effort and produce high casualty rates without generating the kind of dramatic victories that attracted remembrancer attention. The Blood Angels and Emperor's Children, by contrast, received assignments to campaigns against more sophisticated enemies where their particular skills would shine and their achievements would be well documented. These assignment decisions, while militarily sound, planted seeds of resentment among Primarchs who felt their legions were being underutilized or assigned to thankless tasks. Perdurabo in particular grew increasingly bitter about the Iron Warrior's consistent assignment to siege warfare and garrison duties, roles that were strategically necessary, but provided little opportunity for the kind of glory his brother Primarchs achieved. The 4th Legion's Primarch began to perceive a pattern of deliberate slight, a sense that Horus and the Emperor viewed his legion as workhorses rather than warriors deserving of recognition and honor. The Emperor's focus on the project beneath the Imperial Palace consumed his attention to a degree that surprised even those who had anticipated his withdrawal from active campaign leadership. Reports from Terra indicated that the Master of Mankind spent days at a time in the deep excavations beneath the palace, emerging only briefly before returning to his work. The nature of this work remained mysterious even to most of the Adeptus Terra, with access to the construction sites restricted to the Emperor himself, select members of the Legio Custodes, and a small number of tech priests whose expertise was deemed necessary. The secrecy surrounding the project generated speculation and rumors throughout the imperial hierarchy, theories about what the Emperor was building and why it required such intense focus. The Webway project, though its name and purpose remained unknown to all but a handful of individuals, represented the Emperor's attempt to solve one of humanity's fundamental vulnerabilities. The Imperium's expansion relied on warp travel, a necessity that exposed ships and their crews to the dangers of the immaterium. The Chaos Gods, whose existence the Emperor kept hidden from most of his servants, could influence and corrupt those who spent too much time exposed to the warp's energies. The creation of a human-controlled network of webway tunnels, similar to those the ancient Eldari had built, would allow humanity to travel across the galaxy without exposing themselves to the warp's corrupting influence. This project, if successful, would revolutionize human civilization and provide security against threats that most Imperial citizens did not know existed. The psychic engineering required for the Webway project pushed even the Emperor's capabilities to their limits. The work involved creating stable passages through dimensions that humans had never successfully navigated, sealing these passages against intrusion by warp entities, and establishing the control mechanisms that would allow safe transit. The Emperor needed to maintain constant psychic pressure to hold the growing Webway network stable, while simultaneously expanding it and reinforcing sections that showed signs of weakness. This work demanded his full attention and could not be interrupted without risking catastrophic failure that might tear open permanent rifts between real space and the warp. The Emperor's increasing distance from his legions and Primarchs created opportunities for forces that sought to exploit divisions within the Imperium. The Chaos Gods, observing humanity's expansion with growing concern, recognized that the Emperor's withdrawal presented chances to corrupt his servants that had not existed while he maintained direct oversight. The seeds of doubt and resentment that had been planted in some Primarchs' minds through their experiences and treatment could be nurtured and grown into something more dangerous. The sense of abandonment that several Primarchs felt, the questions about their value and purpose, and the frustrations about recognition and respect all represented vulnerabilities that could be exploited by entities whose understanding of manipulation exceeded human comprehension. The Warmaster himself was not immune to these pressures, though his position and relationship with the Emperor provided some protection against the doubts that affected his brothers. Horus bore the weight of responsibility for the entire Great Crusade, making decisions that would affect billions of lives and shape humanity's future for millennia. The burden of this responsibility, combined with the Emperor's absence and the knowledge that his father was focused on work, considered more important than the military campaigns Horus commanded, created stress that even a Primarch's enhanced physiology and psychology could not completely shield against. The seeds of future darkness had been planted, waiting for circumstances and malevolent influences to provide the conditions they needed to grow into something that would threaten everything the Emperor had built. The immediate aftermath of the Ullanor triumph saw the Luna Wolves undergo their transformation into the Sons of Horus, a renaming that carried profound symbolic weight throughout the Imperium. The decision emerged from within the Legion itself, with senior captains approaching their Primarch to propose the change as recognition of his elevation to Warmaster. Horus initially resisted, viewing the gesture as excessive and potentially divisive among his brother Primarchs. The 16th Legion's warriors persisted in their arguments, emphasizing that the name change would cement their identity as the Warmaster's own force and distinguish them from their previous role as simply another legion among many. Horus eventually accepted, recognizing that his sons needed this symbolic evolution to match the practical changes in their responsibilities and status. The renaming ceremony occurred aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the massive battle barge that served as Horus's flagship and mobile command center. The Legion's captains gathered in the ship's primary assembly hall, a space large enough to accommodate thousands of warriors. Horus addressed his sons directly, acknowledging their loyalty and the battles they had fought together since his rediscovery on Thonia decades earlier. The Primarch emphasized that the name change represented not abandonment of their heritage, but evolution toward a new purpose. They would remain the warriors they had always been, but now they would carry the additional burden of serving as the Warmaster's primary instrument for prosecuting the Great Crusade's most critical campaigns. The practical implications of this transformation extended beyond mere nomenclature. The Sons of Horus received priority for equipment upgrades and reinforcement, their status as the Warmaster's Legion ensuring they had access to the best wargear the Mechanicum could provide. Forge worlds throughout the Imperium received instructions to fulfill requisitions from the 16th Legion ahead of requests from other formations. This preferential treatment generated resentment among some other legions, particularly those whose Primarchs already harbored concerns about favoritism and unequal recognition. The Iron Warriors and Word-Bearers noted these disparities with particular bitterness, viewing them as confirmation of systemic bias within the command structure. The Great Crusade's momentum accelerated following Ullanor, the victory demonstrating that no Xenos empire could withstand the Imperium's concentrated might. Expeditionary fleets pushed into regions previously considered too dangerous or remote to prioritize. The destruction of Urlakk Urg's empire had opened vast territories in the galactic east that could now be explored and brought into compliance without fear of massive orc counterattacks. Imperial forces encountered scattered resistance from minor Xeno species and isolated human civilizations, but nothing approaching the scale of threat that Ullanor had represented. The campaign tallies grew rapidly as world after world accepted Imperial rule or fell to military force. Horus coordinated these operations from the Vengeful Spirit, his command staff processing reports from hundreds of active campaigns across multiple segmentums. The Warmaster demonstrated the organizational capabilities that had earned him the position, maintaining awareness of strategic developments throughout Imperial space while delegating tactical authority to commanders on the ground. His approach emphasized flexibility and adaptation, allowing individual primarchs and fleet commanders to adjust their methods based on local conditions rather than imposing rigid doctrine from above. This management style produced results, with compliance rates exceeding projections and casualty figures remaining within acceptable parameters for most operations. The strategic impact of Ullanor manifested in multiple dimensions beyond simple territorial expansion. The campaign had proven that the Imperium could concentrate overwhelming force when necessary, projecting power across vast distances and sustaining complex operations for extended periods. This capability influenced calculations throughout the galaxy, as Xenos civilizations and human polities evaluated their options when confronted with Imperial expansion. Many chose negotiation and peaceful integration rather than military resistance, recognizing that opposition would likely result in destruction rather than independence. The propaganda value of Ullanor's documentation by remembrancers amplified this effect, with images and accounts of the triumph circulating throughout Imperial space and beyond. The opening of new fronts created opportunities for legions that had been held in reserve or assigned to garrison duties during the Ullanor Campaign. The Space Wolves received authorization to pursue campaigns in the northern reaches of the galaxy, where their particular skills in planetary assault and close-quarters combat would prove valuable against scattered orc remnants and other threats. The Salamanders deployed to volcanic worlds in the galactic south, their resistance to extreme heat making them ideal for operations in environments that would challenge other formations. The Raven Guard conducted reconnaissance and infiltration operations ahead of main Imperial advances, their stealth capabilities allowing them to gather intelligence and eliminate key targets before conventional forces arrived. The psychological impact of his elevation on Horus developed gradually, the changes subtle enough that even those closest to the Warmaster initially failed to recognize their significance. The burden of responsibility for the entire Great Crusade's success weighed heavily, each decision carrying implications that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. Horus found himself making choices that determined which worlds received priority for compliance operations, which Xenos threats warranted immediate attention, and which human civilizations could be allowed to continue independent existence pending future integration. These decisions affected billions of lives, and the weight of that responsibility created stress that even a Primarch's enhanced psychology struggled to process completely. The Emperor's absence from active oversight meant that Horus lacked the guidance and validation he had previously relied upon when facing difficult choices. The Master of Mankind had served not just as Supreme Commander, but as mentor and father, his presence providing reassurance that decisions aligned with broader strategic objectives. Without that direct connection, Horus needed to trust his own judgment and accept that mistakes would be his responsibility alone. The Warmaster maintained regular communication with Terra through astropathic channels, but these exchanges lacked the immediacy and depth of face-to-face consultation. The Emperor's responses to Horus's reports grew increasingly brief and delayed as his focus on the Webway project intensified, the messages often consisting of simple acknowledgments rather than detailed guidance. Pride began to take root in Horus's psyche, a subtle shift from the confidence that had always characterized his personality toward something more problematic. The Warmaster's achievements were undeniable and his capabilities exceptional, but the constant praise from subordinates and the deference shown by officials throughout the Imperium fed a growing sense of his own indispensability. Horus began to view himself not just as the Emperor's chosen instrument, but as the individual truly responsible for the Great Crusade's success. The military victories accumulated under his command, the territories brought into compliance, and the threats eliminated all reinforced this perception. The distinction between serving the Emperor's vision and pursuing his own objectives grew increasingly blurred. The seeds of vulnerability to chaos corruption were planted during this period, though their growth would require specific circumstances to trigger. Horus's pride made him susceptible to suggestions that his contributions were undervalued, or that the Emperor had abandoned the Great Crusade to pursue projects of questionable necessity. The frustration he felt about the lack of detailed information regarding the Webway project created openings for doubt about the Emperor's priorities and judgment. The stress of command and the isolation that came with supreme authority left Horus emotionally vulnerable in ways he had never experienced during his earlier service as simply one Primarch among many. These psychological weaknesses would remain dormant until events on Davin provided the catalyst for their exploitation by forces whose malevolence exceeded anything the Warmaster could imagine. The campaign against the Interrex demonstrated both Horus's capabilities and the growing complications in his decision-making process. The Interrex represented a human civilization that had achieved remarkable technological sophistication and maintained peaceful coexistence with certain Xeno species. Their society challenged imperial doctrine about humanity's necessary supremacy and the fundamental incompatibility between humans and aliens. Horus initially pursued diplomatic engagement with the Interrex, recognizing that their advanced technology and organized military forces would make conquest costly. The negotiations proceeded promisingly until an incident involving the theft of a chaos-corrupted weapon by elements within the Imperial expedition triggered conflict. The resulting war destroyed the Interrex civilization, eliminating a potential ally and demonstrating the fragility of diplomatic solutions when cultural differences ran deep. The Warmaster's handling of the Interrex situation revealed the pressures affecting his judgment. Horus had genuinely sought peaceful integration, but the outbreak of hostilities led him to prosecute the war with characteristic efficiency and thoroughness. The destruction of the Interrex's infrastructure and the elimination of their leadership ensured they could never threaten imperial interests, but it also represented the loss of knowledge and technology that might have benefited humanity. Some observers questioned whether the conflict had been necessary or if alternative approaches might have salvaged the diplomatic effort. Horus defended his decisions publicly while privately acknowledging doubts about whether he had exhausted all options before resorting to military force. The Great Crusade's continued expansion under Horus's command brought the Imperium into contact with increasingly diverse civilizations and threats. Each encounter required assessment and decision-making about how to proceed, with options ranging from peaceful integration to complete extermination. The Warmaster developed patterns in his approach, favoring military solutions when diplomatic efforts showed signs of complications or delay. This tendency toward aggressive action reflected both his background as a warrior and the pressures of maintaining the Great Crusade's momentum. Horus recognized that the Emperor expected results, that worlds brought into compliance represented tangible achievements, while failed negotiations appeared as wasted time and resources. The relationship between Horus and his brother Primarchs evolved under the new command structure, with varying degrees of success depending on individual personalities and circumstances. Sanguinius remained close to the Warmaster, their friendship deepened by shared experiences during Ullanor and mutual respect that transcended formal rank. The Blood Angels Primarch served as confidant and advisor, providing perspective that helped Horus navigate the political dimensions of his position. Guilliman maintained professional cooperation with the Warmaster, though their different approaches to military organization and administration sometimes created friction. The Ultramarines Primarch believed in systematic documentation and standardized procedures, while Horus preferred flexibility and adaptation to local conditions. The deterioration of relationships with certain Primarchs created fault lines that would later prove catastrophic. Mortarian's distance from Horus grew as the Death Guard's campaigns took them further into the galactic fringe, their communication reduced to formal reports and strategic updates. The 14th Legion's Primarch felt increasingly isolated from the broader Imperial command structure, his concerns about the Emperor's focus on psychic projects dismissed or ignored. Perdurabo's resentment festered as the Iron Warriors continued receiving assignments to grinding siege warfare and garrison duties, their achievements acknowledged, but never celebrated with the enthusiasm directed toward more glamorous victories. The 4th Legion's Primarch began to perceive deliberate slight in these assignments, viewing them as evidence that Horus and the Emperor considered his legion expendable workhorses rather than elite warriors. The Emperor's increasing isolation on Terra, as he focused on the Webway project, created a vacuum in the Imperium's spiritual and political leadership that no one could fully fill. The Master of Mankind had served as the unifying force that held together the disparate elements of Imperial society, his vision providing direction and his authority settling disputes. Without his active presence, competing interests within the Imperium began asserting themselves more forcefully. The Council of Terra, responsible for civilian administration, sometimes found itself in conflict with military commanders over resource allocation and strategic priorities. The Mechanicum pursued its own objectives with increasing independence, their cooperation with Imperial military forces remaining functional, but losing the seamless integration that the Emperor's oversight had maintained. Retrospective analysis by Imperial historians who survived the Horus Heresy identified Ullanor as the high watermark of the Great Crusade and the Imperium's unity. The campaign represented the moment when humanity's resurgent empire achieved its greatest concentration of power and purpose, when the Emperor and his Primarch stood together in common cause against a threat that required their combined might. The Triumph ceremony captured this unity in visual form, the assembled legions and Imperial forces demonstrating capabilities that no other civilization in the galaxy could match. The elevation of Horus to Warmaster seemed a natural evolution that would allow the Great Crusade to continue its success under proven leadership, while the Emperor pursued projects that would secure humanity's long-term future. The irony of Ullanor's glory containing the seeds of the Civil War to come remained invisible to participants at the time. The very success that justified Horus's elevation also fed the pride that would make him vulnerable to corruption. The Emperor's withdrawal to focus on the Webway project, while strategically sound from his perspective, created the absence that allowed doubt and resentment to grow among Primarchs who felt abandoned. The command structure changes that were necessary to manage the Great Crusade scale introduced hierarchies and inequalities that generated friction between legions. The momentum of continued expansion created pressures to maintain success rates that would eventually drive commanders toward increasingly aggressive and morally questionable decisions. The transformation of the Luna Wolves into the Sons of Horus symbolized both the heights the Imperium had reached and the dangers of personalizing authority that had previously been vested in institutions and shared purpose. The 16th Legion's identity became tied to their Primarch in ways that transcended normal Legion loyalty, their service to the Emperor mediated through their devotion to Horus rather than flowing directly from commitment to the Imperial cause. This shift multiplied across the other legions that maintained intense personal loyalty to their own Primarchs, created conditions where the Imperium's unity depended on the continued alignment of 20 demigods whose relationships with each other and their father were complex and sometimes troubled. The road to heresy stretched ahead invisibly from Ullanor's triumph, its path determined by decisions not yet made and circumstances not yet encountered. Horus would lead the Great Crusade to further victories in the months and years following his elevation, his capabilities as Warmaster validated by continued success. The corruption that would eventually claim him waited for the specific combination of injury, manipulation, and circumstance that would occur on Davin. The other Primarchs who would eventually join his rebellion harbored grievances and doubts that required nurturing by malevolent forces before they would turn against their father. The Imperium stood at its zenith, unaware that the foundation of its unity contained fractures that would soon tear it apart in the most catastrophic civil war humanity had ever experienced.